Hello, my dears, and welcome to Insightful Vision, where curiosity settles in and science strolls gently enough to ease you toward rest. Tonight's journey is about one of the most traumatic cold snaps in our planet's history. Imagine the world warming after a long ice age, glaciers shrinking, rivers rushing free, life slowly returning to green valleys and open plains. Then suddenly, without much warning, the warmth faltered. The chill of the Ice Age returned almost overnight and held Earth in its grip for over 1,000 years. Scientists call this moment the Younger Dryas. But you might think of it as the time when Earth pressed pause on spring and brought winter back in force. It's a story of shifting climates, struggling humans, and mysteries still debated today. A world poised on the brink of change, only to be yanked back into the cold. Before we unravel what happened, I'd like to know something about you. Where are you listening from right now? And how is the weather outside your window? Because while we talk about a world suddenly frozen, your world may be warm, rainy, or perhaps already wrapped in its own kind of chill. That small detail, your personal season, connects us back to the bigger picture of Earth's constant dance with climate. And if you find this gentle exploration soothing, or if it helps you drift off as you learn, a like or a subscribe would mean a lot. It helps this quiet space reach others who might also want to wind down with science stories. No rush, no pressure, just something to consider. Now, let's settle in. Because what happened over 12,000 years ago is more than just geology and ice. It's a reminder of how fragile and surprising Earth's climate can be, and how deeply it shaped the people who lived through it. The Younger Dryas begins at a time when the great ice sheets of the last glacial maxima were retreating. For tens of thousands of years, ice had covered much of North America, northern Europe, and Asia. At the peak of the Ice Age, massive glaciers stretched for miles, burying mountains and carving valleys. But by about 14,000 years ago, the climate was shifting. Temperatures rose, glaciers melted, and large lakes formed across the continents. Rivers swelled with meltwater, ecosystems changed, and animals spread into new territories. Mammoths, giant bison, and other megafauna still roamed the land, but they were sharing their shrinking icy world with humans who were learning to hunt, gather, and eventually experiment with farming. For a while, everything seemed to point toward a warming Earth. Forests expanded, grasslands grew greener, and humans found more opportunities to settle down rather than endlessly follow migrating herds. But then something changed. Instead of continuing into a warmer, more stable climate, the planet slipped back into cold conditions, almost as severe as the Ice Age itself. This sudden return of freezing temperatures is what scientists later called the Younger Dryas, named after a hardy little Arctic flower, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen showed up in ancient sediment cores as evidence of the cold. Wherever those flowers grew, the chill must have returned. What makes the Younger Dryas so fascinating is how abrupt it was. Within only a few decades, global temperatures plunged, glaciers stopped retreating, and in many places, they began advancing again. Imagine living in a world where within the span of your grandparents' lifetime, the warming Earth suddenly reversed course. Seasons lengthened into winters. Crops struggled, herds dwindled, and communities had to rethink survival. And yet, people did survive. They adapted, shifted, and carried on. Without them, without the resilience of those ancient communities, human history might look very different today. So, why did this happen? That question has driven decades of scientific research. Clues lie in ice cores drilled from Greenland, where layers of snow compacted into ice record year-by-year changes in climate. These frozen records show clear evidence of the Younger Dry, a sharp drop in temperature, 1,000-year stretch of cold, and then an equally abrupt return to warmth. Other evidence comes from lake sediments, fossils, and even ancient charcoal, suggesting widespread fires. Taken together, the evidence tells us something extraordinary happened, but the cause is still debated. Some researchers argue it was a shift in ocean currents triggered by sudden floods of meltwater. Others suggest volcanic activity or even the impact of a comet. Whatever the mechanism, the result was undeniable. Earth's climate flipped back to Ice Age conditions in an astonishingly short time. For humans living through it, this shift wasn't measured by graphs or scientific papers. It was felt in bitter winds, shorter growing seasons, and harder hunts. Groups like the Nufians in the Near East had just begun experimenting with early agriculture, harvesting wild cereals and settling into villages. The younger Dryas forced them to adapt, perhaps even spurring the transition to more organized farming as wild resources grew scarce. In other parts of the world, hunter-gatherers had to follow shifting animal herds or move into new regions less affected by the freeze. These choices would echo through history, shaping where and how civilizations would later emerge. As the cold dragged on, the ecosystem shifted. Large mammals that had flourished during the warming period began to vanish. Some of this extinction wave may have been caused by human hunting, but the younger Dryas surely added pressure. Without stable climates and reliable food sources, species like the mammoth and saber-toothed cat found it hard to survive. Meanwhile, smaller, more adaptable animals thrived, filling the ecological gaps left behind. When the Younger Deuce finally ended about 11,500 years ago, the world warmed again just as abruptly as it had cooled. Within decades, temperatures climbed, glaciers retreated once more, and the Holocene epoch began, the stable, warm period that continues to this day. For humans, this shift opened the door to farming, permanent settlements, and eventually the rise of civilizations. In that sense, the Younger Deuce, harsh as it was, may have pushed humanity toward the path that led to modern societies. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Tonight, as we step into this story, we'll move slowly. We'll look at the world before the Younger Dryas, at the sudden return of ice, at the different theories that try to explain it, and at the ways it changed the people who lived through it. It's a tale of climate swings, fragile balances, and survival against the odds. And it all begins with Earth warming, ice melting, and life cautiously returning to the land, only for winter to seize it all back again. Before the great cold snap we call the Younger Deuce, the Earth was already in the middle of one of the most dramatic transitions in its long history. For tens of thousands of years, glaciers had sprawled across continents, carving valleys, damming rivers, and shaping the landscapes we still recognize today. At the peak of the last ice age, about 20,000 years ago, enormous ice sheets blanketed much of North America, northern Europe, and Asia. They were miles thick in some places, heavy enough to press the land beneath them downward. Entire mountain ranges were buried under walls of ice, and the sea levels were lower by more than 100 meters compared to today, exposing wide coastal plains where humans and animals could travel. By about 14,000 years ago, though, that world was changing. Earth's orbit, subtle shifts in its tilt, and rising greenhouse gases were all combining to warm the planet. The great glaciers began to retreat, valleys filled with meltwater, creating lakes so large they seemed like inland seas. Rivers swelled and surged, reshaping landscapes with their floods. Forests began to expand where once there had been tundra. Grasslands spread across areas that had been barren. For the first time in thousands of years, the natural world felt like it was waking up from a long frozen sleep. For the people living in this time, the change was both an opportunity and a challenge. Humans had already proven themselves extraordinary survivors. They had endured the worst of the Ice Age by hunting the great mammals of the steppe and tundra. By gathering plants and by adapting to harsh conditions, they traveled in small groups, moving with the seasons, following herds of mammoths, bison, and reindeer. Now, with the warming world, they were encountering new environments. Rivers opened paths into the interior of continents. Forests offered different game and plants along the coasts where sea levels had been so low, people could walk across regions that would later be drowned beneath the oceans. It was in this time of warming that great changes in human culture began. In the Near East, groups of people known as the Nufians were starting to experiment with something new. Instead of constantly moving, they began building more permanent shelters. They harvested wild grains, stored seeds, and lived for longer periods in one place. It wasn't farming in the way we think of it now, but it was the first hint of a shift that would eventually lead to agriculture. In Europe, people began carving figurines, painting caves, and leaving behind art that told of their lives and their beliefs. In Asia, groups traveled along rivers and coasts, trading stone, shells, and ideas. This was a world in motion, warming, greening, and becoming more diverse. But even as the ice retreated, it did not disappear quietly. The melting glaciers released torrents of water that reshaped entire continents. In North America, the melting of the Laurentide ice sheet created massive proglacial lakes. One of them, Lake Agassiz, covered hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. It was so large that it rivaled today's Great Lakes many times over. These vast reservoirs of meltwater were unstable, held back only by ridges of ice and sediment. When they broke, floods poured across the land with unimaginable force. Entire river valleys were scoured clean. New channels were carved. Some of these catastrophic floods may have carried enough fresh water into the oceans to disrupt the delicate circulation of currents that regulate Earth as climate. This warming world was also still home to an incredible array of animals. Mammoths with shaggy coats, mastodons with long tusks, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and enormous bison roamed across the continents. Herds larger than humans stalked the grasslands. These animals had thrived in the open, frozen landscapes of the Ice Age. But now, as forests spread and climates changed, their habitats were shrinking. Some species adapted, others did not. Humans hunted them, used their hides for clothing, their bones for tools, and their meat for food. To live alongside these animals required skill, cooperation, and deep knowledge of the land, and in turn, the presence of humans put pressure on the very creatures that had sustained them. In Europe, the retreat of the glaciers revealed new lands that had been buried under ice for thousands of years. The soil was raw and fresh, quickly colonized by hardy plants. Soon, birch and pine forest began to grow. Rivers once blocked by ice now flowed freely, carrying fish and attracting animals. People followed, exploring these new frontiers, leaving behind stone tools and hearths as signs of their presence. Archaeological sites show that humans lived close to the edge of the retreating ice, moving in as the glaciers pulled back, never far behind the shifting boundary of cold. In Asia, vast steppes stretched across Siberia, supporting reindeer and horse herds. People here developed extraordinary skills for surviving in such environments, building shelters from bones and hides, and learning to use every part of the animals they hunted. Along the coasts of what is now China and Japan, humans fished, gathered shellfish, and began to experiment with pottery, one of the earliest examples of such technology in the world. In Africa, warmer climates supported expanding savannas and forests where humans hunted antelope, gathered fruits, and lived in diverse environments that had shaped our species since its beginnings. The world before the Younger Deuce was not uniform. While the general trend was warming, local climates varied. In some regions, ice still dominated. In others, warmth had already brought forests and grasslands. But everywhere, people were adapting, finding new ways to live, experimenting with new tools, and slowly shaping the environment around them. Fires were set to clear land. Stone sickles harvested wild grasses, and settlements began to appear more regularly. The seeds of agriculture and permanent societies were quietly being planted, though no one at the time could have known where those seeds would lead. It is in this moment of change, of warming and promise, that the story of the younger Dryas begins to matter. Because just as people were settling into new rhythms, just as forests were growing and animals were adjusting, the sudden return of cold would throw all of it into uncertainty. Looking back, it's tempting to see this warming period as a prelude, a fragile pause before the shock of winter's return. But for those living through it, it must have felt like a world full of possibility. The long ice age seemed to be loosening its grip. The land was greener, the rivers were alive, and the sky seemed a little wider. And then, within a few generations, everything changed again. The retreat of the great ice sheets was one of the most dramatic natural events the Earth has ever seen, and it set the stage for everything that followed. For tens of thousands of years, glaciers had covered vast portions of the northern continents. They were so thick in some areas, more than 2 miles deep, that they pressed down the crust beneath them. Whole regions were physically depressed under the weight of ice. The Laurentide ice sheet in North America stretched from what is now the Arctic Ocean down past the Great Lakes, covering nearly all of Canada and much of the northern United States. In Europe, the Fennoscandian ice sheets spread across Scandinavia, the British Isles, and northern Germany, while in Asia, enormous tongues of ice pushed out over Siberia. Together, these ice sheets held enough frozen water to drop sea levels worldwide by more than 100 meters. Earth's orbit shifted and greenhouse gases accumulated. The balance began to change. Around 19,000 years ago, the long process of melting began in earnest. At first, the retreat was slow, but once started, it gained momentum. Every summer brought longer melting seasons, and every year, the glaciers lost more ice than they regained in winter. The edges of the ice sheets pulled back, revealing land that hadn't seen the sun in tens of thousands of years. Vegetation began creeping into these new areas. First hardy mosses and lichens, then grasses, then shrubs, and finally forests where glaciers once scraped bare rock. Entire ecosystems began to take root. The retreat was not steady or even. Sometimes glaciers paused for centuries. At other times, they collapsed in great surges. As they melted, enormous amounts of water were released, forming massive lakes across the continents. In North America, Lake Agassiz was the largest of them all. At its maximum, it stretched over an area larger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. Imagine an inland sea filled with icy meltwater held in place by ridges of ice and land. Similar lakes formed in Europe and Asia, dammed by the retreating glaciers. These bodies of water were unstable, and when their ice or sediment dams broke, catastrophic floods poured across the land. One of the most famous examples of such an outburst flood happened in the Pacific Northwest of North America. Geologists call them the Missoula floods. Repeatedly, as an ice dam broke near present-day Montana, a torrent of water the size of multiple modern rivers combined surged westward, racing across Washington and Oregon at incredible speeds. Entire valleys were stripped bare. Giant boulders were transported for miles, and deep scablands were carved into the basalt. When the floodwaters reached the Pacific Ocean, they changed coastlines in an instant. These events were not small disturbances. They were continent-shaping forces reshuffling the geography of entire regions in a matter of days. The retreat of the glaciers also changed sea levels dramatically, as water once locked in ice sheets poured back into the oceans. Coastlines shifted. Land bridges that had connected continents disappeared beneath rising seas. The most famous of these was the Bering Land Bridge, which for thousands of years connected Siberia to Alaska. It had provided a migration route for humans and animals moving between Asia and the Americas. As the seas rose, the land bridge shrank, and eventually it vanished altogether. Coastal plains that had stretched for hundreds of miles offshore were drowned, leaving behind the narrower coastlines we recognize today. What had been vast hunting grounds and travel routes became sea floors. Entire human settlements may have been lost beneath the rising waters. Their traces are buried out of reach. While glaciers melted and seas rose, The land that had been pressed down under the ice began to rise back up. This process is called isostatic rebound. When the crushing weight of 2 miles of ice lifted, the bedrock slowly began to spring upward. Even today, thousands of years later, parts of Canada and Scandinavia are still rising by a few millimeters each year as they adjust from the vanished ice sheets. For people living on this rebounding land, the effect would have been slow but noticeable across generations. Shorelines shifted as land rose out of the sea, rivers changed course, lakes drained or refilled. The earth itself was flexing and reshaping as it recovered from the burden of the Ice Age. The retreat of the giants also meant the retreat of the animals that had lived in their shadow. Mammoths, mastodons, woolly rhinoceroses, and giant ground sloths were among the megaporna that roamed during the height of the Ice Age. They had thrived in the open grasslands and tundra that bordered the glaciers, grazing on hardy plants and migrating across vast ranges. But as forests spread into these areas and climates grew warmer, their food sources and habitats shrank. Some species adapted to new conditions, but many did not. The warming period after the last glacial maximum coincided with a wave of extinctions, especially in North America, where many of the largest animals disappeared within a few thousand years. Human hunting likely played a role, adding to the pressures of shrinking habitats for humans themselves. The retreat of the glaciers opened up new opportunities. In North America, as the Laurentide ice sheet receded, corridors opened between the ice masses, allowing people to move south into lands that had been inaccessible. Archaeological evidence shows that humans quickly spread into these new territories, leaving behind stone tools and campfires. In Europe, the opening of lands in Scandinavia allowed humans to expand northward. Hunters followed reindeer herds into freshly exposed valleys. Rivers became highways of travel and trade, connecting groups across long distances. In Asia, coastal routes opened up, allowing communities to fish and gather along shores that had once been blocked by ice. The melting giants were not only shaping the land and seas, they were also influencing the climate itself. Glaciers are enormous reflectors of sunlight. When they covered large areas, they bounced much of the sun's energy back into space, keeping Earth cooler. As they retreated, darker land and water absorbed more sunlight, amplifying the warming. But at the same time, the torrents of meltwater pouring into the oceans affected currents that moved heat around the globe. These massive disruptions to the ocean conveyor belt may have been one of the triggers for the sudden cooling that marked the Younger Dryas. Earth was not just passively warming. It was lurching, adjusting, and sometimes responding violently to the changes. Life during this time was a balancing act between opportunity and danger. For humans, newly exposed lands meant more game, more plants, and more places to live. But it also meant uncertainty. Floods could erase entire valleys in days. Rising seas could cut off settlements. Shifting climates could change hunting grounds overnight. Communities had to be mobile, flexible, and skilled at reading the land. They passed knowledge from one generation to the next. Stories of floods, of cold winds returning, of lands that rose or sank. These stories may be the distant ancestors and myths still told today about great floods and frozen ages. In the Middle East, the retreat of the glaciers contributed to a more stable climate that allowed early human groups to begin experimenting with agriculture. Wild cereals like wheat and barley grew in abundance. People began to harvest and store them, eventually leading to cultivation. The retreat of the giants created the conditions that made farming possible. Without the melting, the fertile valleys that cradled the beginnings of civilization might never have existed. In South America, the retreat of mountain glaciers opened highland valleys to farming communities thousands of years later. The disappearance of ice was not just an ending. It was a beginning, but the retreat was never a simple linear process. Sometimes glaciers surged forward again, briefly reclaiming land before melting back once more. Climate oscillations were common with periods of warming followed by sudden reversals. People living through these shifts had no way to predict what would come next. They could only adapt as best they could, relying on mobility, cooperation, and ingenuity. What must have seemed like the final end of the Ice Age was not truly the end. The Earth still had one more surprise waiting. One last surge of cold that would test everything humans and ecosystems had learned during the retreat of the giants. And as the warming gathered pace, as rivers swelled and seas rose, as forests spread and animals vanished, the stage was being set for that sudden reversal. The younger Dryas was approaching, and the retreating ice would once again play its part in reshaping the fate of the planet. By the time the ice sheets had pulled back far enough to reveal new landscapes, the Earth's climate was in a delicate balance. The world was no longer locked in the grip of the coldest Ice Age conditions, but it had not yet reached the stable warmth that we know as the Holocene. It was a world in between, a world on edge where small changes in temperature, in currents, or in rainfall could cascade into major shifts across continents. To live during this time was to live with uncertainty. Seasons could be unpredictable, rains could fail, cold winds could return when least expected, and entire regions could swing between abundance and scarcity in a matter of decades. For scientists today, this period stands out as one of the most sensitive chapters in Earth's climate history. Ice cores from Greenland show wild fluctuations in temperature, sometimes within just a few years. Layers of pollen trapped in lake sediments reveal forests advancing and retreating almost as if they were breathing. Geological records mark sudden floods, shifting coastlines, and dust storms sweeping across regions that had dried out. Everything about the planet's climate at this time suggests it was unstable, sensitive to small pushes, and teetering between ice and warmth. One of the reasons for this instability was the sheer amount of fresh water entering the oceans. The retreating glaciers were not melting gently like ice cubes in a drink. They were releasing torrents of water, sometimes steadily, sometimes in violent bursts. These floods poured into the North Atlantic, the Arctic, and the Pacific, and they changed the salinity of the oceans. Salt is one of the hidden engines of global circulation. The Great Ocean Conveyor Belt, also known as thermal circulation, depends on differences in temperature and salinity to move water around the globe. Warm, salty water flows north, cools, sinks, and drives currents that spread heat worldwide. Too much fresh water pouring in from melting ice dilutes that system. It makes the water less dense and prevents it from sinking as it should. Disrupt the conveyor belt, and you disrupt the climate. Evidence suggests this may have happened more than once during this transitional period. Some scientists believe sudden pulses of meltwater slowed the circulation of the Atlantic, cooling Europe while warming the southern hemisphere. Others argue that feedback loops between vegetation, ice, and atmosphere created sudden swings. Whatever the mechanism, the result was clear. The climate could change quickly, faster than humans or ecosystems could easily adapt. For the people living through this, the signs would have been felt rather than analyzed. Hunters in Europe may have noticed reindeer herds shifting routes, no longer appearing in valleys they had relied on for generations. Gatherers in the Near East might have seen wild cereals failing to ripen in colder summers. Fisherfolk along the coast could have watched as storms grew harsher or fish moved into different waters. Life in a climate on the edge was life in constant motion, never knowing if the next year would bring warmth and abundance or cold and scarcity. In many ways, this uncertainty may have spurred innovation. When the environment cannot be counted on, survival depends on flexibility. Groups learn to diversify their diets, to move when conditions change, to develop new tools and strategies for unpredictable circumstances. Archaeological evidence shows that during this time, people experimented more with grinding stones, harvesting seeds, and processing plants. In other places, they refined hunting weapons, building lighter, more efficient projectile points. These adaptations suggest a direct response to a world that refused to settle into predictable rhythms. Animal life also reflected this climate tension. Some species like reindeer and muskox thrived in the cooler conditions. Others, like the great mammoths and mastodons, struggled as forests replaced grasslands. The predator population shifted as prey species moved. Ecosystems that had been stable for thousands of years began to shuffle like cards in a deck, rearranging themselves with every climate swing. To observers at the time, these changes must have been startling. Imagine seeing a landscape change in your own lifetime, not just season by season, but permanently altered within a single generation. Where once had been open grassland, now there might be young birch and pine. Where once had been a reliable river crossing for migrating animals, now floods or droughts had made the route impossible. Dust was another sign of a climate on edge. Geological records from around this time show layers of fine silt deposited across large regions carried by strong winds. This dust suggests periods of drying when vegetation failed to hold soil in place. Dry years would have been harsh on both humans and animals, reducing food availability and forcing migrations. For those living through it, dust in the air would not have been a distant geological signal. It would have been something you could taste on your tongue, feel on your skin, and see drifting in the sky. It was the atmosphere itself, reminding you that stability was not guaranteed. The delicate balance of this period is why the younger Dryas is so striking. It shows what can happen when that balance tips suddenly. For about 1,000 years, the world had been warming, though unevenly and with setbacks. Forests were spreading, seas were rising, and human groups were adjusting to new patterns. Then, almost without warning, the warmth collapsed, and Ice Age conditions returned. The fact that such a dramatic reversal could happen at all speaks to just how unstable the climate already was. It was perched on a knife's edge, and all it took was one push. Whether from meltwater, volcanic activity, or even a cosmic impact to send it tumbling back into cold. For modern scientists, this period is more than just an ancient curiosity. It is a warning. The Earth's climate system has shown itself capable of abrupt change, far faster than the gradual shifts people often imagine. A warming world can lurch into cooling. A cooling world can suddenly warm. The triggers may vary, but the sensitivity of the system remains. That sensitivity was felt deeply by people 12,000 years ago, and it is something we are still grappling with today. The people who lived in this climate on the edge left behind traces that tell us how they responded. In the Levant, the Nufian culture shows evidence of semi-century villages, stone houses, and the harvesting of wild grains. But when the younger Dryer struck, many of these villages were abandoned or shifted. People had to adjust when the climate no longer supported the resources they had begun to rely on. In northern Europe, evidence of shifting animal bones in archaeological sites suggests changing diets as prey animals moved or vanished. In North America, changes in tool styles may reflect adjustments to new hunting conditions as megapora populations declined. Everywhere, the instability of the climate shaped human choices, forcing migrations, innovations, and sometimes collapses. The Earth itself carried the scars of this fragile period. Rivers cut new channels through freshly exposed land. Coastlines shifted as sea levels rose unevenly. Glacial outburst floods left behind giant boulders and scoured valleys. Sediment layers in lakes and oceans recorded sudden changes in vegetation, temperature, and chemistry. It is these records that allow scientists today to reconstruct the climate on the edge. Without them, we would only have fragments of the story, scattered artifacts and bones. With them, we can see the big picture. A world in transition, teetering between two states, vulnerable to disruption. To imagine the daily experience of living through such times is to imagine resilience on a scale most of us rarely consider. Every season carried risk. A warmer year might mean more plants, more game, more fish. But if that warmth tipped into drought, rivers could shrink and crops could fail. A colder year might mean reindeer and bison in greater numbers. But if the cold lingered, forests would recede and firewood would grow scarce. Communities had to read the land constantly, interpret its signals, and respond quickly. Those who failed to adapt would not survive long. And yet, despite this uncertainty, people continued to thrive. They created art, tools, and new ways of living. They told stories, raised children, and imagined futures. The climate was unstable, but human determination was not. That balance between the unpredictability of the earth and the persistence of people is what carried humanity through this precarious time. As the warming continued, the sense must have grown that the Ice Age was finally ending. Glaciers were retreating, forests were spreading, and seas were rising. But beneath that hope lay a fragile truth. The climate was still on edge, and the earth was about to remind everyone just how unstable it could be. Around 12,800 years ago, just when the earth seemed to be on the verge of leaving the Ice Age behind for good, the climate lurched in the opposite direction. Warming had been underway for over 1,000 years. Forests were spreading, seas were rising, and humans in several parts of the world were settling more permanently. Then suddenly, almost without warning, that warming stopped. Within only a few decades, global temperatures dropped back to levels not seen since the height of the Ice Age. In places like Greenland, ice core records suggest drops of 10 to 15 C in less than a human lifetime. Winters lengthened, summers cooled, glaciers halted their retreat, and in some regions advanced again. Scientists later gave this sudden return of glacial conditions a name. They called it the Younger Dryas, after a small Arctic flower whose pollen appeared in layers of soil from that period, marking the return of cold-adapted ecosystems. To understand how sudden this event was, imagine living in a world where your grandparents remembered warming forests, new plants, and longer growing seasons. They would have told you stories of rivers swelling with meltwater, of game animals finding new pastures, of a world slowly growing greener after millennia of ice. And then, in your own lifetime, the warmth would fade. The rivers would freeze longer, plants would fail to bloom, and the chill of winter would settle into every season. The change happened so fast that entire generations grew up under one climate only to see it vanish before they reached old age. The Younger Deuce lasted for about 1,200 years. In geological time, that is an eye link. But for the people and animals who lived through it, it was an eternity. It was not a brief cold snap or a short setback. It was a full return to glacial conditions, long enough to shape cultures, to shift ecosystems, and to leave lasting marks on the Earth's surface. And when it ended just as abruptly as it had begun, giving way to the warmth of the Holling, the epic that continues today. The cause of this sudden reversal has been debated for decades. The leading explanation involves the delicate balance of the oceans. As glaciers melted, enormous lakes of fresh water formed across the continents. The largest of these, Lake Agassiz in North America, was dammed by ridges of ice. At some point, one of these ice dams broke, releasing a flood of fresh water into the North Atlantic. This sudden pulse of fresh water diluted the salty ocean, interfering with the thermal in circulation. The great conveyor belt that carries warm water north and sinks it into the depths. Without that circulation, heat no longer moved efficiently into the northern hemisphere. Europe and parts of North America plunged back into cold. Other scientists have proposed different triggers. Some point to volcanic eruptions that could have spewed ash and aerosols into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and cooling the Earth. Others suggest a more dramatic cause, the impact or airburst of a comet or asteroid. Supporters of this hypothesis point to unusual layers of microscopic particles and sediments from this time, including tiny spherules of melted rock and elevated levels of platinum. They argue that an extraterrestrial impact could have triggered widespread fires, disrupted climate systems, and set off the younger Deuce. The evidence remains controversial and debate continues. It may be that no single cause explains it all, and that a combination of factors, floods, currents, volcanoes, and perhaps impacts conspired to push the Earth back into an icy state. For those living through it, the cause did not matter. What mattered was survival. Archaeological evidence shows that human communities were forced to adapt quickly. In the Near East, where groups like the Nufians had begun experimenting with sedentary life, the return of cold made wild cereals less reliable. Some villages were abandoned, while others doubled down on cultivating plants, setting the stage for the first true farming communities. In Europe, hunters shifted focus as prey animals moved or declined. In North America, the Clovis culture, known for its distinctive spear points, appears to have vanished during this period, replaced by other tool traditions that suggest new ways of hunting and gathering in harsher conditions. The younger driver was not just about cold. It also brought shifts in rainfall patterns. In some regions, it meant drought. Evidence from Africa suggests that lakes shrank dramatically during this period, turning fertile areas into deserts. In Asia, the Indian monsoon weakened, affecting rivers and the societies that depended on them. These shifts in rainfall would have been just as devastating as cold, reducing food supplies, forcing migrations, and creating new stresses on human populations. Plants and animals also responded in dramatic ways. Cold-adapted species expanded their ranges again. The Arctic flower that gave the younger Dry its name spread southward. Tundra plants replaced forests in many areas. Reindeer and other cold-loving animals thrived, while species that had moved north during the warming period were forced to retreat or perish. Megafauna that were already under stress from climate changes and human hunting faced even greater challenges. The younger Dryas may have pushed some of them to extinction. The mammoth, the mastodon, and other giants of the Ice Age disappeared not long after this period. What makes the younger Deuce remarkable is not only the suddenness of its onset and the severity of its cold, but also the equally abrupt way it ended. Around 11,500 years ago, the cold conditions gave way to warmth again in just a few decades. Temperatures rose, glaciers retreated, and the Holocene began. For humans, this final shift was a turning point. With the return of warmth, agriculture spread rapidly. Permanent settlements grew. Civilizations began their long march toward the present. Without the end of the younger Deuce, the trajectory of human history would have been very different. To put it simply, the younger Dryas was a test. It was a 1,000-year interruption, a reminder of how unstable Earth's climate can be. It forced humans to innovate, to adapt, and to find new ways of living. It reshaped ecosystems, ended species, and redirected the course of history. And though it happened 12,000 years ago, its lessons remain relevant. Because the Earth's climate system, then as now, is not a slow, predictable machine. It is capable of abrupt change, sudden reversals, and surprises that can alter the fate of entire civilizations. When we talk about the younger Deuce today, we're not just telling an ancient story. We are looking into a mirror that shows how fragile our relationship with climate has always been. The people of that time had no control over the forces that froze their world. They could only adapt, endure, and wait for warmth to return. In that sense, the younger Dryas is not just history. It is part of the ongoing story of humans and the planet we live on. A story that continues in our own uncertain climate today. And so, after warming, after retreating glaciers and rising seas, after new opportunities and fragile hopes, the world was thrust back into the cold. The younger Dryas had arrived, and for more than a millennium, Earth would remain in its grip. When the younger Dryas began, the change was so sudden that it felt less like a gradual shift and more like the Earth itself had flipped a switch. Regions that had been warming for centuries fell back into glacial conditions. The transformation was so abrupt that scientists studying ice cores from Greenland can see the change unfold within just a few thin bands of frozen snow. In human terms, that meant the difference between a landscape opening up with new plants and animals, and that same land, only a generation later, locked in tundra once again. To those alive at the time, it must have felt like the warmth had been stolen, replaced by the relentless chill of an ice age that refused to die. Greenland is where the evidence is clearest. Ice cores drilled from the ice sheet reveal temperature records going back over 100,000 years. Within those frozen layers lies the unmistakable signal of the younger dry. The data shows that in less than a decade, average temperatures plunged by as much as 10 to 15 C. Imagine a single lifetime in which summers that once grew longer and milder suddenly shortened. Forests that had begun to take root shriveled back into sparse shrubs. Rivers that had flowed freely with melt water began freezing over for longer stretches of the year. That was the reality of the younger Dryas, a climate shift that truly seemed to happen overnight. In northern Europe, where humans had started to push into lands exposed by retreating glaciers, the reversal was brutal. Communities that had followed herds of reindeer and bison into freshly opened valleys suddenly found those same valleys frozen and barren again. Forests that had been spreading northward stopped abruptly, and tundra plants reclaimed the land. The cold winds returned with a force that reshaped the migration patterns of animals and the lives of the people who depended on them. For anyone living there, the world must have seemed to change before their eyes, as if the promise of warmth had been nothing more than a false start. In the Near East, where groups like the Natufians had begun to experiment with sedentary life, the younger Dryas was equally disruptive. These people had started building stone houses, storing wild cereals, and living in larger, more permanent villages. The return of cold brought harsher seasons and unreliable harvests. Wild barley and wheat that had grown abundantly during the warming period no longer ripened as easily. Game animals moved unpredictably. Villages that had seemed stable were suddenly vulnerable. Archaeological evidence suggests that many of these communities were abandoned or forced to adapt, turning to new strategies to survive the prolonged cold. Ironically, this struggle may have pushed humans further toward farming, as the uncertainty of wild resources encouraged them to take greater control over their food supply. In North America, the younger dews coincided with major changes to both climate and ecology. The great proglacial lakes created by retreating glaciers poured fresh water into the oceans, altering currents and temperatures. The Clovis culture, famous for its distinctive spear points, appears to have disappeared around this time. Some archaeologists argue that the decline of the Clovis people was tied to the changing climate and the disappearance of megafauna that had sustained them. Mammoths, mastodons, and giant bison were already under pressure, but the younger Deuce may have been the final blow. As these animals declined, humans had to find new ways to hunt and gather, shifting to smaller game, fish, and plant foods. The cold did not just freeze the land. It reshaped entire ways of life. The impact of the younger Dryas was not limited to cold alone. Rainfall patterns shifted dramatically in Africa. The Great Lakes shrank, Lake Victoria and Lake Tanganyika. Vast bodies of water that had supported fish, birds, and human settlements dropped to low levels. The Sahara, which had been greener during the warming period, dried out once again, returning to arid conditions. This desert expansion forced human groups to move, clustering around the Nile and other reliable water sources. In Asia, the Indian monsoon weakened, reducing rainfall across large regions. Rivers that had been dependable became erratic, altering both ecosystems and human settlements. The younger Dryas also left evidence in the fire. In many regions, layers of charcoal in the soil suggest that wildfires spread widely during this time. Some researchers argue these fires were sparked by a sudden change in vegetation as forests died back and grasslands expanded. Others suggest that if a comet or meteor impact played a role in triggering the Younger Dryas, the fires may have been part of the immediate aftermath. Whatever the cause, the result was clear. Landscapes burned, ecosystems shifted, and people had to contend with environments that seemed hostile and unstable. For plants, the Younger Dryas meant contraction. Trees that had spread northward retreated. Birch and pine forests that had been advancing across Europe stopped their march and in many places disappeared. Grasses, mosses, and tundra plants replaced them. For animals, this meant new food sources for some, but starvation for others. Cold-adapted species like reindeer and muskox expanded their ranges, but warmer weather species were forced southward or into extinction. For humans, these ecological shifts were more than just background changes. They determined where food could be found, what tools were needed, and where settlements could survive. The sudden return of cold also reshaped coastlines. Rising seas had already begun to flood coastal plains, but in some regions, the cold slowed or altered the pace of melting. Communities that had relied on certain coastal resources had to adjust as sea levels fluctuated unpredictably. In other places, floods from glacial lakes continued to carve new channels and reshape landscapes. The combination of rising seas, sudden freezes, and catastrophic floods made the Younger Dryas a time of constant change. One of the most striking things about the Younger Dryas is how quickly it ended. After more than a millennium of cold, the climate warmed again in less than a century. In some regions, the change was even faster, occurring within just a few decades. To people living then, this would have been as disorienting as the onset of the Younger Deuce itself. Children who had grown up in cold, barren landscapes would have seen forests return before they reached middle age. Rivers would have thawed, plants would have flourished, and animals would have returned to lands long abandoned. It was a second transformation, just as dramatic as the first, and it marked the beginning of the Holy Sign epoch, the warm, stable period in which all of recorded human history has unfolded. The phrase, "a world turned cold overnight," is not just a metaphor. It reflects the real pace of change recorded in the Earth's climate archives. To us, a shift of a few degrees might sound small, but in climate terms, it is monumental. It means the difference between ice sheets advancing or retreating, between forests thriving or dying, between rivers flowing or drying up. For the people of the Younger Dryas, those differences were matters of life and death. What makes this story even more remarkable is how resilient humans proved to be. Despite the shock of the sudden freeze, communities adapted. They shifted diets, moved settlements, experimented with farming, and passed down knowledge of survival. They endured over 1,000 years of harsh conditions and emerged into the warmth of the Hallene with new strategies, new skills, and new ways of life. Without that resilience, without the ability to survive a world turned cold overnight, the course of human history might have been cut short. And so, as the Younger Dryas settled in, as ice reclaimed land and winds blew colder, people adjusted once more. They had lived through the peak of the Ice Age, through warming, through floods, and shifting landscapes. Now they faced another long winter, a winter that would last for centuries. The world had turned cold again, and humanity would have to live within it until warmth returned. When the Younger Dryas tightened its grip, it was not only temperatures that changed. The living world itself shifted dramatically. Plants withered or retreated. Animals that had once spread into new lands pulled back or vanished. And people who had started to settle into promising new ways of life were thrust back into the uncertainty of survival in harsher conditions. To understand this period, it helps to see how deeply connected these three elements, plants, animals, and people, really were. One could not change without altering the fate of the others. The return of the cold was most obvious in the vegetation. Before the Younger Dryas, forests had been expanding northward across Europe and parts of North America. Birch, pine and hazel trees were pushing into areas that had once been tundra. Their presence transformed entire ecosystems, supporting deer, boar, birds, and countless smaller species. With a sudden chill, that expansion stopped. In many areas, forests collapsed back into open tundra, dominated by hardy grasses, mosses, and dwarf shrubs. The tiny Arctic flower Dryas, whose pollen gave this period its name, spread southward once again. It was a clear sign that cold-adapted species were reclaiming the land. This retreat of forests had enormous consequences. For herbivores that fed on woody plants, it meant shrinking food supplies. For predators that depended on those herbivores, it meant dwindling prey. For humans, it meant the loss of dependable firewood, building material, and food sources. In a single lifetime, entire landscapes could be transformed from wooded valleys rich in resources to sparse tundra, where survival required constant movement and adaptation. The animal world responded quickly. Cold-loving species such as reindeer, muskox, and Arctic hare flourished. Their ranges expanded, and they provided vital food for both humans and predators. Other species like red deer and wild boar retreated southward following the shrinking forests. For megafauna such as mammoths, mastodons, and giant ground sloths, the younger Dryas was another heavy blow. Already pressured by human hunting and shrinking habitats, they now faced climates that were far less forgiving. Many of these animals would not survive the 1,000 years of cold that followed. By the time warmth returned, they were gone, leaving only bones and stories behind. Predators adapted as best they could. Wolves and foxes shifted with their prey, sometimes coming into closer contact with human groups as they hunted the same animals. Large cats like the saber-toothed tiger were already in decline, their specialized hunting strategies making them vulnerable when prey populations changed. Smaller, more flexible predators did better. The balance of ecosystems was reshuffling, and flexibility often determined survival. For humans, the younger Dryas was a shock to every part of life. In Europe, groups that had followed herds into newly opened lands suddenly found those lands less hospitable. Archaeological evidence suggests shifts in hunting strategies with more emphasis on smaller, quicker game. When the great herds dwindled, tools became lighter and more versatile, designed to adapt to a wider range of prey. People had to move more often, abandoning camps when food grew scarce, returning to a more nomadic existence after centuries of experimenting with semi-permanent life. In the Near East, the Nufians faced one of the greatest challenges. Before the younger Dryas, they had begun building stone houses, storing food, and living in larger communities. Their lives were moving toward greater stability, supported by wild cereals that grew abundantly in the warming climate. When the cold returned, harvests grew unreliable. Some communities were abandoned. Others adapted by investing even more in controlling plants. Instead of giving up, some Nufians began tending wild cereals more carefully, eventually leading to the domestication of wheat and barley. In this way, the harshness of the younger Dryas may have directly pushed humanity toward the agricultural revolution. Without the freeze, farming might have taken centuries longer to emerge. In North America, human cultures were also deeply affected. The Clovis people, known for their distinctive stone spear points and their hunting of megapora, seemed to disappear from the archaeological record during the younger Dryas. Their decline coincides with the extinction of mammoths and mastodons. As the cold returned and large animals vanished, humans were forced to adapt. They turned to smaller game, fish, and plant foods, developing new tools and strategies suited to the new conditions. The disappearance of the Clovis culture is one of the enduring mysteries of this period. But it is clear that climate played a central role. Food scarcity was not the only issue. The return of the cold also altered water supplies. In Africa, lakes shrank, rivers shifted, and once fertile areas dried out. Human groups clustered around reliable water sources like the Nile, changing settlement patterns that would influence history for millennia. In Asia, the weakening of the monsoons created drier conditions across large regions, forcing migrations and new adaptations. These changes would not have been abstract to the people living there. They would have been experienced directly in the failure of crops, the drying of wells, and the long walks required to find drinkable water. Cold, scarcity, and unpredictability also influenced human culture. Stress often sparks innovation, and the younger Dryas was no exception. People developed new tools, refined their shelters, and found ways to survive in harsher environments. They created clothing suited to colder climates, built sturdier houses, and learned to store food more carefully. At the same time, art, ritual, and storytelling continued. Carvings, paintings, and figurines from this period suggest that even in hard times, humans sought meaning, connection, and beauty. Survival was never just about food and shelter. It was also about community and shared identity. The younger Dryas also left its mark in oral traditions. Many cultures around the world preserve stories of great cold, sudden floods, or dramatic changes in the environment. While it is impossible to prove direct links, it is tempting to see echoes of this period in those myths. Tales of lost animals, endless winters, or worlds turned upside down may be distant memories passed down across generations. The freeze was so profound that it may still echo in the stories told by descendants thousands of years later. One striking feature of this period is how uneven its impacts were. Not every region experienced the same degree of cold. Some areas grew drier rather than colder. Others saw both. The instability of the global climate meant that conditions varied dramatically from place to place. For humans, this created both challenges and opportunities. Some groups suffered declines, while others adapted and even flourished in the new conditions. The ability to move, to share knowledge, and to innovate made the difference between collapse and resilience. The freeze also shaped the future of domesticated animals and plants. As people began to experiment with controlling food sources, certain species were favored. Goats and sheep, hardy animals able to survive on sparse vegetation, became increasingly important in the Near East. Dogs, already companions in hunting, became even more valuable in harsher conditions, helping track and capture prey. Plants that could withstand cold and unpredictable weather were the first to be cultivated. These early choices made under the pressure of the younger Deuce laid the foundations for the agriculture and animal domestication that would define human life in the Halling. The relationship between people and their environment was never more evident than in this period. Every change in vegetation, every shift in animal populations, every variation in rainfall rippled through human societies. The younger Deuce was a reminder that humans were not separate from nature. They were part of it, bound to the same cycles, subject to the same forces. Survival meant understanding those forces, adapting to them, and sometimes even trying to bend them as with the first steps toward farming. As the younger Dryas continued, generation after generation grew up knowing only its conditions. For them, the cold and scarcity were not interruptions. They had a normal life. Entire lifetimes passed without any hint that warmth might return. People were born, raised families, and died within the freeze, never imagining that the world would soon change again. It was a 1,000-year winter, long enough to define cultures, shape ecosystems, and alter the course of history. And yet, even in this long freeze, life continued. Plants found niches to survive. Animals adapted to new ranges. People innovated, endured, and carried on. When the warmth finally returned, it would be these survivors, plants, animals, and humans that would shape the next chapter of Earth's story. But during those centuries of cold, the world belonged to resilience. When people first began to uncover the story of the younger Dryas through ice cores, pollen records, and ancient sediments, the obvious question was why? How could the Earth, after more than 1,000 years of warming, plunge back into conditions so much like the Ice Age almost instantly. And how could it hold that state for more than a millennium before switching again, just as quickly, into the relative stability of the halving? The mystery of the Younger Deuce has fascinated scientists for decades, not only because of what it tells us about the past, but because it shows how sensitive the climate system is to disruptions and how easily it can flip from one state to another. The most widely discussed explanation involves the oceans. Our planet's climate is not governed by air alone, but by the enormous conveyor belt of currents that redistribute heat across the globe. This circulation is driven by differences in temperature and salinity, hence the name thermaline circulation. Warm, salty water from the tropics moves northward along the surface of the Atlantic, cools in the higher latitudes, becomes dense enough to sink, and then flows back south in the deep ocean. This process carries enormous amounts of heat, keeping northern Europe much warmer than it would otherwise be at its latitude. Disrupt that system, and the results can be dramatic. As the great ice sheets melted, they released vast amounts of fresh water into the oceans. North America was home to some of the largest glacial lakes ever to exist, including Lake Agassiz, which at its peak covered more than 400,000 kilometers. For thousands of years, it was held back by ice dams, but those dams were fragile. When they broke, the water released was enough to flood entire continents. Geological evidence shows that some of these floods were catastrophic, rushing into the North Atlantic in a matter of days or weeks. If enough fresh water poured in at once, it would have diluted the salty ocean surface, preventing it from sinking. Without sinking water in the north, the conveyor belt would stall. And when it stalls, the north cools quickly, while other regions may warm or dry out as circulation shifts. This theory explains a lot about the Younger Dry. It matches the suddenness of the onset, the duration of the cold, and the abrupt return of warmth once the system restarted. Ice cores from Greenland show the drop in temperature that would result from a shutdown of circulation. Sediment cores from the ocean reveal changes in salinity and in the deposition of microscopic organisms that thrive in different conditions. Together, the evidence suggests that fresh water flooding the North Atlantic played a major role. But not everyone is satisfied with this explanation. Some argue that while meltwater pulses clearly happened, the scale and timing don't always line up perfectly with the Younger Dryas. This has led to other theories, some involving volcanic eruptions. Large eruptions can inject ash and sulfur into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and cooling the Earth for years at a time. A massive eruption at the right moment could have tipped the climate into a prolonged cold phase. While smaller eruptions are well documented during this period, evidence for one single eruption large enough to trigger the Younger Dryas remains uncertain. Still, volcanoes could have contributed, especially if their cooling effects combined with other disruptions. Then there is the most controversial idea of all, the impact hypothesis. In 2007, a group of researchers proposed that a comet or asteroid may have exploded over North America, releasing energy equivalent to multiple nuclear bombs. They pointed to unusual materials and soil layers from the Younger Deuce boundary, microscopic spherules of melted rock, elevated levels of platinum, and fragments of carbon that could come from widespread fires. According to this idea, the explosion would have set forests ablaze, filled the atmosphere with dust and soot, and disrupted climate systems, triggering the Younger Dryas. It might also help explain the sudden disappearance of the Clovis culture and the extinction of many megapora in North America. The impact hypothesis generated intense debate. Critics argue that the evidence can be explained in other ways, and that no clear crater has ever been found that dates to the right time. Supporters counter that an air burst like the Tunguska event in Siberia in 1908 would not necessarily leave a crater, but could still cause widespread devastation. The argument continues with new studies on both sides. Some researchers find more evidence of impact-like materials. Others say the data is inconsistent. For now, the idea remains unproven, but not entirely dismissed. Another angle considers interactions between different parts of the climate system. It may not have been one single cause, but a combination. Meltwater floods weakened circulation. Volcanic eruptions added cooling. Perhaps even an extraterrestrial event provided a final push. In such a fragile system, multiple small triggers could add up to one large shift. The younger Dryas may not have had a single cause at all, but instead represented the climate reaching a tipping point where multiple stresses converged. The mystery deepens when you look at regional differences. In Europe and Greenland, the cold was severe. But in the southern hemisphere, some regions warmed instead. Rainfall patterns shifted globally. Monsoons weakened in Asia, but rainfall increased in South America. This complexity suggests that the younger Dryas was not a simple global freeze, but a reorganization of the entire climate system. Any explanation has to account for those differences. A shutdown of the Atlantic circulation fits that picture, as it would redistribute heat unevenly across the globe. But other factors likely played roles too. For humans at the time, the mystery was not about causes, but about consequences. They didn't know about ocean currents or volcanic aerosols or cosmic impacts. What they knew was that the weather had turned against them, that food was harder to find, that old strategies no longer worked. For them, the younger Dryas was not an academic puzzle, but a lived reality of hunger, cold, and adaptation. Yet in the modern era, understanding the causes matters greatly. If the climate can flip so suddenly from warming to cooling or from stable to unstable, then we need to know what triggers those shifts. The younger Dryas is a reminder that Earth's climate does not always move gradually. It can change in steps, jolts, and plunges. Today, as scientists study these causes, they're also thinking about the present. The Atlantic circulation system, the same one that may have been disrupted during the younger Dryas, is showing signs of weakening again due to modern warming and freshwater input from melting ice in Greenland. While it is unlikely that we'll see a repeat of the younger Dryas exactly, the possibility of abrupt climate changes remains. Studying the past is one way to understand what the future might hold. The mystery of the younger Deuce remains unsolved, but the pieces of the puzzle are slowly coming together. Ice cores, sediments, fossils, and archaeological sites all add to the picture. Each clue tells us something about what happened 12,000 years ago, but also something about how the Earth works now. In that sense, the search for the cause is not just about history. It is about understanding the system we live in, the forces that shape our world, and the potential surprises that may still lie ahead. And so, while scientists continue to debate meltwater floods, volcanoes, comets, and tipping points, the deeper truth is clear. The Earth is capable of sudden shifts. The younger Dryas was one of them. A 1,000-year reminder that climate is not stable, not fixed, but alive, responsive, and sometimes unpredictable. The mystery may not be fully solved, but the lesson is already plain. When people hear about the younger Dryas, one explanation comes up again and again: the disruption of the oceans. To understand why, you have to picture the global circulation of water as a vast conveyor belt moving slowly but powerfully around the planet. It's not a simple loop, but a complex system driven by differences in temperature and salinity. Warm, salty water from the tropics flows northward near the surface of the Atlantic. When it reaches colder latitudes, it cools, becomes denser, and sinks, forming deep currents that travel back south. This sinking water pulls more warm water northward, creating a circulation that transports enormous amounts of heat. Without it, northern Europe would be far colder than it is today, closer in climate to Siberia than to the mild temperate lands we know. This circulation is known as thermohaline circulation, from the Greek words for heat and salt. It is one of the engines of Earth's climate. By moving heat between the tropics and the poles, it keeps the planet's climate relatively balanced. It also drives nutrient cycles in the oceans, bringing up deep, nutrient-rich waters that feed plankton and sustain marine ecosystems. In short, the conveyor belt doesn't just keep northern Europe warm. It helps regulate the entire planet's climate and ecology. The trouble is, this system is sensitive. It depends on the right balance of salt and temperature. If too much fresh water is added to the North Atlantic, the surface water becomes less dense and doesn't sink as it should. If the sinking slows, the whole conveyor belt weakens. If it stops, heat is no longer carried north in the same way. The result is rapid cooling across the northern hemisphere. This is why scientists studying the younger Dryas look so closely at freshwater floods from melting glaciers. During the end of the last ice age, meltwater lakes were enormous. Lake Agassiz in particular held more water than all the modern Great Lakes combined. For centuries, it was dammed by ice. Its waters trapped on the continent, but ice dams are not permanent. At some point, one or more of them failed. When they did, the release of fresh water was catastrophic. Imagine an inland sea emptying into the Atlantic in a matter of months or even weeks. The sudden rush of water diluted the ocean salinity, and the conveyor belt faltered. Evidence for this disruption comes from multiple sources. Sediment cores taken from the bottom of the Atlantic show changes in the types of microscopic organisms living there. Some species thrive in warm, salty waters. Others prefer colder, fresher conditions. The abrupt switch in species in these cores coincides with the younger Dryas. Chemical analyses of the sediments also reveal changes in oxygen isotopes that reflect shifts in temperature and circulation. Together, these records point to a sudden weakening of the Atlantic conveyor just when the younger Deuce began. The green and ice cores tell the same story from another angle. The sharp drop in temperatures recorded there matches what would be expected if the conveyor slowed or stopped. Europe and North America would have cooled rapidly, while the tropics and southern hemisphere would have been affected in more complex ways, with some regions drying and others warming. This redistribution of heat and rainfall patterns fits the global signature of the younger Dryas. The conveyor belt theory doesn't explain everything, but it explains a lot. It accounts for the speed of the onset, the scale of the cooling, and the fact that the changes were not uniform worldwide. It shows how a relatively small trigger, fresh water flowing into the ocean, could ripple through the entire climate system in ways that transformed the Earth for more than 1,000 years. For people living at the time, the conveyor belt was invisible. They didn't know about salinity or density-driven currents. What they experienced was its consequence. Shorter summers, harsher winters, less predictable rains, and the return of tundra where forests had been growing. But today, with the benefit of science, we can see that their hardships may have begun with the quiet faltering of a current thousands of miles away. What makes the conveyor belt theory so compelling is not only that it explains the younger Dryas, but that it has relevance. Now, modern climate research shows that the Atlantic circulation is weakening again, this time because of fresh water from melting Greenland ice and increased rainfall from global warming. While a full shutdown like the younger Dryas is unlikely in the near future, even a slowdown could have serious consequences. Colder winters in Europe, shifting monsoons in Africa and Asia, stronger storms in the tropics, and disruptions to marine ecosystems. The same system that shaped the younger Dryas is still at work today, reminding us that climate is not fixed, but dynamic. The conveyor belt also illustrates how interconnected the Earth system is. Glaciers on land affect oceans. Oceans affect the atmosphere. The atmosphere affects rainfall. Rainfall affects plants and animals. And plants and animals affect humans. One change sets off another in a chain reaction. The younger Dryas was not caused by one factor in isolation. It was the result of a cascade, and the ocean conveyor was the central link in that chain. Some scientists still argue about details. Did the fresh water come from Lake Agassiz or from another meltwater source? Was the release sudden or spread out over centuries? Did the conveyor stop completely or just weaken dramatically? These questions matter for reconstructing the exact mechanics of the younger gas. But for understanding the larger picture, the key point is clear. The conveyor belt is both powerful and fragile. Powerful enough to regulate the climate of half the globe, fragile enough to be disrupted by floods of fresh water. This fragility is what makes the younger Dryas such a powerful lesson. Climate change is often thought of as slow, unfolding over thousands of years. But the conveyor belt shows that it can change suddenly within decades, and that the consequences can last for centuries. That is why the story of the younger Dryas is not just about the past, it is about the future as well. For the people who lived through it, the conveyor belt's faltering was the reason why the warmth that had seemed secure slipped away. For us, it is a reminder that the same system still operates beneath the surface of the oceans, silently carrying heat around the planet. If it weakens too much again, the disruptions could be profound. The younger Dryas shows us what that looks like. A world turned upside down, not over centuries, but in a single human lifetime. And so the great conveyor belt, normally steady, normally hidden from notice, may well have been the unseen hand that plunged the Earth back into ice. It was not the only factor, but it may have been the most important. The mechanism through which other forces, glacial floods, melting ice, or even impacts were able to change the entire world. If the younger Deuce was triggered by a disruption to the oceans, then the floods of meltwater released from retreating glaciers were the most likely culprits. These were not ordinary floods. They were events on a scale so massive it is difficult to imagine today. At the end of the last ice age, enormous lakes sat perched on the edges of retreating ice sheets, dammed by ice walls or ridges of earth left behind by glaciers. They were silent reservoirs of catastrophe, holding back volumes of water equal to inland seas. When their barriers failed, the result was not a slow leak, but an unleashing of torrents that reshaped entire continents and poured fresh water into the oceans, with consequences that rippled across the planet. One of the greatest of these lakes was Lake Agassiz. It formed in central North America as the Laurentide ice sheet melted back. At its peak, it stretched over an area larger than all 5 of the modern Great Lakes combined, covering much of what is now Manitoba, Ontario, Minnesota, and North Dakota. Its waters were held in place by the retreating glossa to the north and by ridges of land and ice to the south. For thousands of years it grew, fed by meltwater streams flowing from the shrinking ice sheet. But its stability was an illusion. The ice dams holding it back were vulnerable, and eventually they gave way. When Lake Agassiz drained, it did so catastrophically. Some estimates suggest that enough water was released in a single event to raise global sea levels by several meters. Rivers swelled to sizes never seen before. Valleys were scoured clean of soil. Boulders the size of houses were carried downstream. In the Pacific Northwest, the Missoula floods caused by a similar cycle of ice-dammed lakes filling and bursting left behind a landscape still marked today with giant ripple marks, deep scablins, and flood-carved coulees. These were not local disasters. They were continent-shaping forces rewriting geography in days or weeks. When these floods reached the oceans, they delivered pulses of fresh water so large that they disrupted the salinity balance. In the North Atlantic, where salty water normally cooled, sank, and drove the conveyor belt, this sudden influx of fresh water acted like a barrier. The surface stayed fresher and less dense, preventing the normal sinking motion. The circulation slowed, heat stopped flowing north as effectively, and the climate shifted almost immediately. What had been gradual warming flipped back into glacial conditions. The evidence for these floods is etched into the land. Shorelines of ancient glacial lakes are still visible high above modern terrain. Channels carved by sudden torrent stretch for hundreds of miles. Sediment deposits show where massive amounts of water once surged through valleys and plains. In some places, giant boulders called erratics, carried far from their source, testify to the strength of these floods. Geologists piecing together these clues see a pattern of repeated outbursts, each one capable of causing upheaval, not only locally, but globally. The timing of one of these major outbursts aligned closely with the onset of the Younger Dryas, around 12,800 years ago. Evidence suggests that a sudden release of water from Lake Agassiz or a similar body entered the North Atlantic. Whether it was one catastrophic event or a series of smaller, but still massive floods, the effect was the same. The conveyor belt faltered, and the climate plunged back into cold. For people living at the time, these floods would have been terrifying and disorienting. Entire landscapes could disappear in days. Valleys once rich in plants and animals could be swept clean. Rivers that had been reliable sources of water and fish could become raging torrents impossible to cross. For communities that live close to these great lakes or their outflow channels, survival would have meant sudden flight, abandoning everything as the waters came. It is not hard to imagine that memories of such floods became the seeds of myths told thousands of years later. Stories of deluges, of angry waters, of worlds destroyed and remade by floods. Beyond the immediate destruction, the floods created longer-term changes. New lakes formed as waters pulled in different places. Rivers carved new channels, sometimes flowing in entirely new directions. Sediment was spread across plains, enriching soils in some places while burying them in others. Coastlines shifted as the oceans rose. For humans, animals, and plants, this meant a world in constant motion. What had been fertile one generation could be barren the next, while new opportunities might appear where floodwaters receded. The floods also influenced ecosystems indirectly through their effect on climate. By disrupting the ocean currents, they helped trigger the Younger Dryas. The return of cold reshaped vegetation zones altered animal migrations and forced humans to adapt once more. In this sense, the floods were not just local catastrophes, but global agents of change, setting in motion a chain reaction that froze the world for more than a millennium. The scale of these floods is hard to overstate. Imagine standing on the edge of a vast plain and watching as a wall of water dozens of meters high races toward you, carrying icebergs, trees, and boulders. Imagine the sound, the ground shaking beneath you, the roar of water tearing through valleys, the air filled with mist and debris. For those who survived such events, the memory would have been seared into their culture. It is no wonder that great floods appear in the mythologies of so many societies. The shifting currents caused by these floods did not just cool the north. They altered rainfall patterns around the world. In Africa, monsoon rains weakened, turning green lands back into desert. In Asia, the weakening of the Indian monsoon disrupted rivers and agricultural possibilities. In South America, rainfall patterns changed in the opposite direction, bringing more precipitation to some regions. These uneven effects created a patchwork of challenges and opportunities for people and ecosystems. The floods of meltwater may have begun in one place, but their consequences were felt globally. Today, scientists study these ancient floods not only to understand the Younger Dryas, but also to anticipate the future. As Greenland's ice sheet melts, it too releases fresh water into the North Atlantic. Though not on the same catastrophic scale as Lake Agassiz, the steady flow is already measurable. If enough accumulates, it could weaken the modern conveyor belt, leading to disruptions in climate that echo those of the past. The story of the Younger Dryas and its floods is a warning written in stone and ice. What makes this story even more powerful is the speed of the changes. The Earth system does not always move slowly. It can lurch, driven by sudden events like the draining of a glacial lake. One moment the world is warming, forests spreading, seas rising gradually. The next cold returns and landscapes are reshaped overnight. For humans living then, these lurches were not scientific curiosities. They were lived realities, shaping every decision about where to live, what to eat, and how to survive. And so the floods of meltwater, born from the melting giants of the Ice Age, carried more than water. They carried the power to reshape continents, to disrupt oceans, to trigger ice and fire, and to force humans into new ways of life. They were the hidden hand behind the Younger, one of the greatest climate reversals in history. Among all the explanations for the Youngers, none has sparked as much fascination and controversy as the idea that it was triggered not by water or volcanoes or the ordinary forces of Earth, but by something arriving from beyond. The comet hypothesis suggests that around 12,800 years ago, a fragment of a comet or asteroid entered the atmosphere over North America, exploded in an airburst, and set off a cascade of events that reshaped the climate, the land, and life itself. It is a story that reads like legend with fire from the sky, sudden catastrophe, and a planet thrown into upheaval. And yet some scientists argue that it might be true. The evidence for this hypothesis comes from unusual layers in the geological record across dozens of sites in North America, Europe, and even parts of the Middle East. Researchers have found what they call the Younger Deuce boundary layer, a thin band of soil dating to the start of the Cold Period. Within this layer are microscopic clues, tiny spherules of melted rock, grains of high-temperature minerals, and fragments of carbon that appear to have been formed in intense fires. In some sites, concentrations of platinum are unusually high, a metal often associated with extraterrestrial material. For supporters of the hypothesis, these are fingerprints of an impact or airburst event. The idea is that when a comet fragment, perhaps several kilometers across, entered the atmosphere, it disintegrated with enormous force. Unlike an asteroid that strikes the ground and leaves a crater, this object may have exploded in midair, similar to the Tunguska event in Siberia in 1908, but on a vastly larger scale. The explosion would have released energy equivalent to many nuclear weapons, igniting forests across continents, sending dust and soot into the atmosphere, and potentially destabilizing ice sheets already weakened by melting. The fires alone could have been devastating. Imagine millions of acres of forest set ablaze almost simultaneously. Animals and humans caught in infernos, smoke darkening the sky for months. If such an event happened, the consequences for the climate would have been immediate. The smoke and dust would have blocked sunlight, cooling the earth. The disruption to ecosystems would have been catastrophic, with plants destroyed and animals killed in large numbers. If ice sheets were fractured or destabilized by the blast, meltwater floods could have poured into the oceans, further disrupting circulation. In this way, the comet hypothesis ties together multiple strands of evidence, fires, floods, extinctions, and abrupt cooling into a single dramatic explanation. Supporters of the hypothesis also point to timing. The beginning of the Younger Dryas coincides with the disappearance of the Clovis culture in North America and the extinction of many large animals such as mammoths, mastodons, and giant ground sloths. They argue that an extraterrestrial impact could explain both the human and animal losses, as well as the environmental upheaval. Some even suggest that ancient myths of fire from the sky, floods, or sudden destruction might preserve distant cultural memories of this event. But the comet hypothesis is far from universally accepted. Critics argue that the evidence is inconsistent and that the unusual materials found in the boundary layer can be explained in other ways. Tiny spherules, for example, can be produced by volcanic activity or even wildfires. High platinum levels could come from geological processes within the Earth. The supposed signs of widespread burning, critics say, are patchy and not truly global. Most importantly, no crater has been found that dates to this time. Without a crater, the idea of a major impact remains unproven. Supporters counter that an airburst would not leave a crater, pointing to Tunguska as an example. But skeptics maintain that the scale of destruction, required to trigger the younger Dryas should have left more obvious traces. The debate has become one of the most heated in modern paleoclimatology. New studies appear regularly, some supporting the impact idea with fresh evidence, others undermining it with reanalyses that find no extraterrestrial signature. For example, some researchers have claimed to identify nanodiamonds in the boundary layer, structures that could form under the high pressures of an impact. Others have failed to replicate those results, calling them into question. Some studies of soil chemistry show clear spikes in platinum or iridium, metals associated with meteorites. Others find no such spikes at equivalent sites. The result is a scientific tug-of-war with no definitive resolution yet in sight. Regardless of whether a comet or asteroid really struck, the hypothesis has forced scientists to think about how vulnerable Earth's climate system is to external shocks. We know from other moments in history that impacts can be catastrophic. 66 million years ago, a massive asteroid struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, ending the age of the dinosaurs. That impact set off fires, tsunamis, and a global cooling so severe that most large animals died out. Compared to that, the younger Dryas event, if it was caused by a cosmic visitor, would have been smaller but still devastating. It would show that even relatively modest impacts can tip the climate into chaos, especially when it is already balanced on a knife's edge. For humans at the time, an impact would have been beyond comprehension. Imagine seeing a streak of fire race across the sky, then explode with a blinding flash and a roar that shook the ground. Imagine forests catching fire, animals fleeing, rivers boiling with heat. Survivors would have lived in a world suddenly transformed. The air thick with smoke, the sun dimmed, food sources vanishing. Such an experience would have left deep marks, not just physically, but culturally. It is easy to see how memories of such an event could survive in stories passed down through generations. Even if the comet hypothesis proves wrong, it captures something essential about the younger Dryas: the sense that the event was sudden, unexpected, and catastrophic. Whether the trigger was from space or from within the Earth, the result was the same. Warmth was replaced by cold, stability by chaos, and humanity was forced to adapt once again. Today, the comet hypothesis remains on the edge of scientific consensus, neither fully accepted nor completely dismissed. Some researchers continue to gather evidence, analyzing sediments and ice cores for extraterrestrial signals. Others argue that the focus on cosmic visitors distracts from more plausible explanations like meltwater floods and ocean circulation. The debate is likely to continue as new techniques and discoveries shed light on this ancient mystery. What is undeniable is that the younger Dryas happened, and it happened suddenly. Whether the trigger came from a burst of fresh water, a volcanic eruption, or a comet from the depths of space, the effect on the planet was profound. The Earth froze once more. Ecosystems collapsed and reshuffled. Species disappeared, and humans faced one of the greatest tests in their history. The idea of a cosmic visitor adds drama to the story, but it also reminds us of something sobering. The Earth does not exist in isolation. It moves through a solar system filled with debris, and impacts have happened before and will happen again. Most will be small, but some can be world-changing. The younger Dryas may or may not have been caused by such an event, but the possibility keeps the question alive. It is a reminder that while we study the Earth's inner systems, its oceans, atmosphere, and glaciers, we must also look to the skies where other forces wait, silent and unpredictable. And so, the comet hypothesis remains an open door in the story of the younger Dryas. It may yet be proven right or wrong. Either way, it underscores the mystery of how fragile our climate system can be, how sudden its shifts can become, and how thin the line is between stability and catastrophe. If the younger Dryas was defined by sudden cold, it was also marked by signs of fire. Across the world, in the thin soil layers that correspond to the onset of this great freeze, there are traces of widespread burning. Charcoal deposits, soot particles, and microscopic remnants of combustion appear in sediments and ice cores from North America, Europe, and beyond. Whatever triggered the younger Dryas, it seems to have coincided with a surge of firestorms that swept across continents. These were not ordinary seasonal burns. They were events so extensive that they left a distinct mark in the geological record, one that researchers can identify thousands of years later. The evidence is striking. In North America, layers of sediment from lakes and rivers show sudden spikes in charcoal around 12,800 years ago. Similar patterns appear in Europe and the Middle East. In Greenland, ice cores capture tiny soot particles that must have traveled thousands of kilometers on high winds. These signals point to fires on a continental or even global scale. For scientists, the question is not whether fires burned, but why they were so intense and widespread at this moment in history. One explanation ties back to the comet hypothesis. If an extraterrestrial object exploded in the atmosphere, the shock waves, heat, and debris could have ignited forests across vast regions. Supporters of this idea argue that the carbonary layers at the younger dust boundary are evidence of massive firestorms triggered in this way. They describe a scenario in which entire landscapes were consumed, animals trapped, and humans forced to flee. The soot in ice cores would then represent the global reach of smoke carried into the stratosphere, darkening skies and blocking sunlight. But even without a comet, fire fits into the picture of a climate on the edge. As warming advanced before the younger dust, forest had spread into areas previously dominated by tundra. More trees meant more fuel. A period of drying or sudden climate stress could have turned these expanding forests into tinder boxes. Once ignited, they could have burned far more extensively than the patchy grassland fires of colder times. In this view, the return of cold was not caused by fire, but accompanied by it as the ecosystem shifted violently under stress. Volcanic activity is another possible contributor. Eruptions can ignite local fires directly and also inject ash into the atmosphere, which mixes with soot from other sources. Around the time of the younger Dryas, there is evidence of eruptions in several regions, though none so large that they alone explain the global changes. Still, smaller eruptions combined with other factors might have added to the widespread signature of fire and ash. Whatever the cause, the consequences of such firestorms would have been devastating. Smoke would have filled the skies, reducing sunlight and dropping temperatures locally. Ash would have blanketed landscapes, choking rivers and soils. Animals would have been displaced or killed outright. For humans, fire could destroy settlements, food stores, and hunting grounds in an instant. To live through one of these events would have been terrifying. Flames advancing with unstoppable speed, the air thick with smoke, the ground blackened in their wake. The ecological effects would have lasted long after the flames died. In burned regions, soils could have been sterilized, delaying the return of vegetation. When plants did grow back, they might have been different species, better suited to the new conditions. Animals that depended on forests would have retreated or perished, while those that thrived in open landscapes might have expanded. Fire reshaped ecosystems as much as ice and flood did. For humans, the aftermath of firestorms may have been a double burden. On the one hand, they had to survive immediate destruction. On the other, they faced landscapes stripped of resources. Yet fire also created opportunities. Burned areas could encourage the growth of new grasses, attracting grazing animals. Charred land could make seeds easier to sprout. Some groups may have learned to use fire deliberately to shape their environment. An early step toward managing landscapes rather than simply enduring them. In this sense, the firestorms of the younger Dryas may have influenced human innovation as much as they caused suffering. Culturally, fire would have left a deep impression. Imagine the stories told around hearths after surviving a great blaze. Flames descending from the sky, forests vanishing in smoke, animals fleeing in panic. For generations, such memories could have been passed down as myths of fire from the heavens, of punishment or renewal. It is tempting to see echoes of these experiences in later traditions that describe worlds destroyed by fire and remade. The dust that accompanied these fires was another crucial factor. With forests gone, soils were left bare and vulnerable. Winds could lift fine particles into the air, spreading dust over vast distances. Layers of lowest, wind-blown silt found in many regions may owe part of their origin to this period of instability. Dust storms would have been frequent, reducing visibility, irritating lungs, and making life harsher for both humans and animals. Combined with colder temperatures and shifting rains, the dust added another layer of stress to already fragile societies. Scientists studying this period see fire, ash, and dust not as isolated events, but as part of a system in upheaval. A spark, whether from a comet, a volcanic eruption, or simply natural climate variability, set off fires. The fires released soot and carbon into the atmosphere, amplifying cooling. They destroyed ecosystems, which then produced more dust. Dust altered the atmosphere further, reinforcing droughts and making recovery harder. This feedback loop may have been one reason why the younger Dryas lasted so long. Once the Earth tipped into this state, the combined effects of cold, fire, and dust helped lock it there for more than 1,000 years. For the people of that time, the combined weight of these changes must have been immense. They faced cold that shortened growing seasons, floods that reshaped rivers, and fires that burned the land. Each force alone would have been a challenge. Together, they created a world in constant flux. To endure required flexibility, cooperation, and ingenuity. Evidence from archaeological sites shows that humans responded with all three, developing new tools, moving to safer areas, and forming networks of exchange to share resources. In North America, the disappearance of the Clovis culture may partly reflect the devastation of fire and dust. Large animals that had been central to their way of life were declining. Hunting grounds were disrupted, and new strategies were required. In the Near East, fire and dust may have pushed communities toward farming as they sought stability in an unstable world. In Africa and Asia, changes in vegetation and rainfall forced new patterns of movement and adaptation. Everywhere, the signature of fire intertwined with the broader narrative of the younger Dryas. When scientists drill into ice cores from Greenland and see the dark bands of soot, or when they study ancient soils filled with charcoal, they are not just looking at chemistry. They are looking at the remains of real events, real skies blackened with smoke, real forests that once stood tall and then vanished in flame. It is a direct link to the lived experience of people 12,000 years ago. People who walked through ash and dust just as we might after a modern wildfire, only on a scale beyond anything we know. The younger Dryas is remembered as a time of ice, but it was also a time of fire. Ash and dust carried across continents, settling into lakes and ice sheets, remind us that fire and cold can go hand in hand. While glaciers returned and tundra spread, flames consumed forests and smoke dimmed the skies. This paradox, the world freezing and burning at once, captures the true complexity of the younger Deuce. It was not one disaster, but many, overlapping, feeding into each other, reshaping the planet in ways that still echo today. And as the centuries passed, as generations lived and died under its shadow, the memory of firestorms lingered. For those who survived, the earth was not only a place of cold and hardship, but also of sudden flame, of skies that could darken without warning, of worlds that could be erased overnight. By the time the younger Dryas began, humans were already scattered across nearly every corner of the world. They had endured the worst of the Ice Age, adapted to new lands as the ice sheets retreated, and learned to take advantage of the opportunities created by warming climates. In the Near East, a unique culture had emerged just before the cold returned. Archaeologists call them the Natufians. They lived in what is now Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, a region often described as part of the Fertile Crescent. The Nufians are remembered not for their tools or their art alone, but for a critical turning point in human history. They were among the first to take steps toward farming. Before the Younger Deuce, the Nufians thrived in a landscape that was growing more abundant with each century. Wild cereals like wheat and barley grew in great stands across the Levant. These were not the domesticated crops we know today, but their wild ancestors. They ripened naturally in the warm seasons, producing heavy heads of grain that could be gathered with simple tools. The Nufians learned to harvest these cereals using flint sickle blades to cut the stalks and stone mortar and pestles to grind the seeds into flour. They built more permanent houses than most of their contemporaries, often circular stone structures with hearths inside. Villages of dozens, even hundreds of people began to appear, some of the first true sedentary communities in human history. This shift toward settled life was possible because the environment provided stability. With reliable stands of cereals, abundant game animals, and water from rivers and springs, the Natapians no longer had to move constantly in search of food. They could store grain, dry meat, and build structures that would last more than a single season. They buried their dead in cemeteries decorated with beads and ornaments, evidence of cultural richness and symbolic thought. It was a world moving toward complexity, where food surplus allowed more time for ritual, art, and social bonds. Then the younger Dryas arrived, and the stability the Nufians had begun to build collapsed. The sudden return of cold disrupted the delicate balance of their world. Wild cereals no longer ripened as consistently. Growing seasons shortened, and drought struck the region more frequently. The herds of gazelles and other animals the Nufians hunted shifted their ranges, making them harder to find. Streams and springs that had watered their villages dried out in the prolonged droughts. The same land that had once supported permanent villages now became unpredictable. For many Nufian communities, this meant abandoning the sedentary life they had begun. Villages that had been occupied for generations were left behind as groups returned to more mobile lifestyles, following game and searching for reliable food sources. Archaeological evidence shows clear signs of disruption. Fewer permanent structures, smaller settlements, and a decline in the kinds of tools associated with heavy grain harvesting. It must have felt like a retreat, a step backward from the stability they had hoped to build. But in some places, a different response took hold. Instead of giving up on cereals altogether, some groups began to experiment with ways of managing them more directly. If wild stands failed to ripen on their own, perhaps they could be encouraged to grow closer to home. If seeds were scattered in certain soils, perhaps they would take root and yield more predictable harvests. Over time, this experimentation led to a new relationship with plants. Instead of simply gathering what nature provided, humans began to shape nature to suit their needs. This was the first true step toward farming. The younger Dryas may have been the pressure that forced this leap. Without the sudden cold, the Nufians might have continued gathering wild cereals for centuries without feeling the need to cultivate them. The return of harsh conditions made wild food unreliable, pushing them to seek control. In this way, one of the greatest revolutions in human history, the agricultural revolution, may owe its origins not to abundance, but to scarcity, not to stability, but to crisis. Archaeological sites from this period provide remarkable clues. At places like Jericho, evidence of early attempts at cultivation can be found. Grinding stones, sickle blades with distinctive sheen from cutting cereals, and storage pits all point to a growing dependence on grain. In some cases, seeds show early signs of domestication, with changes in size and shape that suggest human selection. These were not yet fully domesticated crops, but they were on their way, guided by human hands and decisions. The Nufians also left behind evidence of social changes that reflect their shifting circumstances. Burials became more elaborate in some sites with individuals interred alongside beads, shells, and animal bones. This suggests that even in hard times, symbolic and ritual life remained central. Dogs were buried alongside humans in several cases, evidence of one of the earliest domestication partnerships. These animals were not only hunting companions, but members of communities, reflecting the growing complexity of human-animal relationships in this era. The pressures of the younger Dryas may also have fostered cooperation between groups. In times of scarcity, exchange networks become vital. Obsidian from Anatolia, shells from the Mediterranean, and other trade goods have been found in Nufian sites, showing that long-distance connections existed. Such networks would have helped communities survive sharing resources across wider regions when local conditions failed. It is important to recognize that the shift to farming was not a single moment, but a long process. The younger Deuce did not instantly create agriculture, but it provided the crucible in which the first experiments took shape. By the time the cold ended and the Holocene warmth returned, the groundwork had been laid. Humans had learned not only to gather, but to plant, not only to hunt, but to herd, not only to endure, but to shape their environment. Within a few centuries of the younger Deuce ending, fully domesticated crops and animals appeared in the Fertile Crescent, spreading outward to transform the world. The Nufians stand at the center of this story because they represent both sides of the transition. They show what was lost, the villages abandoned, the reliance on wild abundance disrupted, and what was gained, the first tentative steps toward farming, the roots of domestication, the resilience of human innovation. Their story is one of adaptation under pressure, of communities forced to choose between returning to old ways or inventing new ones. That choice shaped the future of humanity. When we think of farming today, it seems inevitable, as though it were the natural outcome of human progress. But in truth, it was a fragile innovation born in the midst of a crisis. Without the younger Deuce, it might not have happened when it did. The Nufians, facing cold, drought, and scarcity, took the first steps toward a different world. They could not have known that their experiments would lead to cities, civilizations, and everything that followed. For them, it was simply survival. For us, it was the beginning of history. And so, as the younger Dryas froze rivers, shortened seasons, and withered wild plants, the Nufians responded in ways that would change humanity forever. Some moved on, chasing game and abandoning villages. Others stayed, experimenting with seeds and soil, laying the foundation for farming. Out of hardship came innovation. Out of instability came control. And out of the freeze came the first sparks of the agricultural revolution. When the younger Deuce began, no community was left untouched. Across continents, the sudden return of cold and the shifts in rainfall forced people to make choices about how they lived, where they moved, and how they adapted. Some chose to abandon their homes and migrate to more favorable lands. Others restructured their diets, their tools, and their social organization to endure the new conditions. What emerges from the archaeological record is a story of resilience and creativity. People did not give up in the face of a 1,000-year winter. They adapted, and in doing so, laid the foundations for much of what followed in human history. Survival in such times meant facing uncertainty as a constant companion. For hunter-gatherer groups in Europe, the abrupt cooling pushed forests back and brought tundra landscapes back into dominance. Animals that thrived in cold conditions, such as reindeer and wild horses, became more important once again. Hunters followed their migrations, adjusting routes and developing new methods for capturing swift-moving prey. Smaller animals, fish, and birds also became more significant food sources. Archaeological sites show shifts in bone assemblages, suggesting that people broadened their diets when the larger game disappeared or moved. Survival meant flexibility, an ability to eat what the land provided, no matter how different it was from what previous generations had relied upon. In the Near East, where the Nufians had begun to explore more settled ways of life, survival meant a difficult choice. Some communities abandoned their villages, returning to mobile lifestyles that allowed them to chase resources across the landscape. Others doubled down on experiments with plants, sowing seeds, and tending them to increase reliability. It was a gamble, but one that eventually led to agriculture. For both groups, the key was adaptation. Neither approach guaranteed security, but both reflected human creativity under stress. Migration was another central strategy. As regions dried or froze, people moved in search of better conditions. In North Africa, the Sahara, which had been greener during the warming before the younger Dryas, dried again into desert. Populations that had spread into these greener lands were forced to retreat toward the Nile Valley, where water remained dependable. This concentration of people in one fertile corridor would have lasting consequences, eventually fostering the conditions for complex societies along the Nile. In Europe, some groups shifted southward as northern lands became too cold, while others clung to the margins of ice sheets, following herds that still thrived there. Migration was not always a choice. Sometimes it was forced, dictated by hunger or thirst, by landscapes that no longer provided what they once had. Adaptation was not only physical but cultural. People developed new tools suited to their changing environments. In North America, after the decline of the Clovis culture, new projectile point styles emerged, smaller and more efficient, better for hunting, smaller game, or fishing. In Europe, microliths, tiny stone blades that could be mounted on arrows or spears, became more common, reflecting a shift toward precision and versatility. In the Near East, grinding stones and storage pits multiplied, evidence of a growing reliance on plant foods. These changes in technology were responses to the shifting demands of survival, proof that people did not simply endure passively, but actively reshaped their ways of life. Social organizations also adapted. Scarcity encouraged cooperation, and many groups likely formed tighter bonds within communities or networks of exchange with neighbors. Archaeological evidence shows that trade in materials such as obsidian, shells, and stone continued even during the Younger Deuce. These exchanges would have been more than luxury. They would have built alliances, creating safety nets in times of shortage. If one group struggled, others might provide resources, knowing that the favor could be returned. In such fragile environments, no group could afford total isolation. At the same time, pressure could create conflict. Migration into new territories sometimes meant competition with groups already there. Scarcity of game or plants could drive tensions leading to skirmishes or territorial disputes. Evidence of violence, while not overwhelming, does appear in some archaeological sites of this period. Survival was not only about cooperation, but also about competition, about defending resources as much as sharing them. Human responses to stress were as complex then as they are today. The adaptations of the Younger Dryas also highlight the role of knowledge. Survival depended not only on physical tools, but on information passed through generations. Which plants could still be eaten when others failed? Where animals migrated in different seasons? How to find water in dry years? Such knowledge would have been essential. Oral traditions, stories, and rituals may have encoded practical survival strategies. By embedding knowledge in culture, communities ensure that even in times of dislocation, wisdom endured. Migration, adaptation, and survival strategies were not limited to basic needs. People continued to create art, ritual, and symbolic expression. Even in these harsh times, cave paintings, carvings, and figurines from the Younger Deuce period show that imagination and creativity were not extinguished by cold and scarcity. On the contrary, symbolic life may have become even more important, providing meaning, cohesion, and resilience. Ritual gatherings, dances, or shared myths could reinforce group identity, helping people endure the uncertainty around them. For many, the Younger Dust would have defined their entire existence. Generations were born, and died without ever knowing a different climate. To them, the cold and scarcity were not interruptions, but the normal order of things. Migration was part of life, adaptation, a constant necessity. Only when the climate warmed again at the end of the Younger Deuce would descendants realize that another world was possible. For those who lived through it, resilience was not a choice, but a condition of life. In hindsight, the adaptations made during this period were pivotal. The turn toward farming in the Near East, the diversification of diets in Europe, the reorganization of hunting in North America, all were direct responses to the pressures of the Younger Dryas. These adaptations set the stage for the hauling when warmth returned and opportunities expanded. Without the survival strategies forged in the freeze, humanity might not have been ready to seize those opportunities. The story of survival, migration, and adaptation in the Younger Deuce is a reminder that humans have always been resilient. The challenges were immense. Sudden cold, failing harvests, vanishing animals, floods, fires, and dust. Yet, people responded not with collapse, but with innovation. They moved, they learned, they cooperated, and they endured. The fact that we are here today is proof of their success. And so, while the Younger Deuce froze rivers and shortened summers, while it forced people from their homes and reshaped their diets, it also sparked new ways of living. Migration created new networks. Adaptation created new tools. Survival created resilience. Out of the crisis came transformation. And out of transformation came the beginnings of the world we know today. When the Younger Deuce ended more than 11,000 years ago, it left behind no written record. The people who lived through it did not carve its story into stone tablets or record it on scrolls. Their voices are silent to us in that sense. And yet, human beings have always told stories, passing memories from one generation to the next. In oral traditions, events that shook entire communities often became myth, layered with symbols shaped by retellings, but carrying the memory of something real. It is in these stories that we may glimpse how people remembered the Great Freeze, the fires, the floods, and the sudden return of warmth. One of the most common themes in mythologies around the world is the flood. From Mesopotamia to India, from the Americas to Oceania, cultures tell of waters rising, of deluges that destroyed lands, of survivors clinging to rafts or mountaintops. These stories echo the catastrophic floods that accompanied the melting of the ice sheets, the breaking of glacial dams, and the rise of seas as the Younger Dryas ended. To those who saw valleys swallowed by water or coasts drowned beneath rising seas, the experience must have been overwhelming. The memory of such events retold for generations may have evolved into the flood myths that became cornerstones of later cultures. Fire, too, appears in many traditions. Myths of fire from the sky, of worlds consumed by flame, of punishment and renewal through burning can be found across continents. If the Younger Dryas truly began with widespread firestorms, whether sparked by comet fragments or by tinder dry forests in a changing climate, then it is easy to see how survivors would tell stories of skies filled with flame. To explain such terror, they may have framed it as divine punishment, as the anger of gods, or as a cosmic event beyond human control. Over generations, those memories could transform into myths of fiery destruction and rebirth. The cold itself also left its imprint. In the northern latitudes, many traditions speak of endless winters, of times when the sun weakened, of worlds locked in ice. Norse mythology, written down much later, but drawing on older traditions, includes the idea of Fimbul winter, a great and terrible winter that precedes the end of the world. While it is impossible to draw a direct line from the Younger Dryas to such myths, the echoes are striking. For people who endured centuries of bitter cold, the idea of a long, punishing winter would have been deeply ingrained, retold, until it became part of cultural memory. In North America, indigenous traditions include stories of great animals that once walked the land but are now gone. Tales of giant beasts, some feared, some revered, may preserve memories of mammoths, mastodons, and other megapora that vanished around the time of the Younger Dryas. To later generations, the bones of these animals found in the ground would have confirmed the stories, creating a link between lived memory and the physical world. The extinction of these creatures was not just a biological event. It was a cultural one, leaving marks and stories that lasted long after the animals themselves were gone. Legends are not literal records. They change with each telling, shaped by the needs and imaginations of those who pass them on. But at their core, many reflect real experiences. Catastrophic floods, devastating fires, long winters, and the disappearance of familiar animals. When archaeologists and anthropologists compare myths with geological and climatic records, they often find surprising parallels. Oral traditions that seem fantastic on the surface may preserve kernels of truth, fragments of memory stretching back thousands of years. For the people of the Younger Deuce, myth would have been more than entertainment. It was a way of explaining the inexplicable, of making sense of chaos. Why had the warmth disappeared? Why did the animals vanish? Why did the waters rise? Myth gave answers when none could be found in nature alone. It also served as a warning, reminding future generations of dangers that could return. Stories of floods may have taught communities to respect rivers and seas. Stories of fire may have taught caution about the skies. Stories of cold may have reinforced the importance of preparation and resilience. Even today, we can feel the resonance of these myths. The biblical story of Noah's flood, the Mesopotamian tale of Utnapishtim, the Hindu legend of Manu, the Hopi stories of previous worlds destroyed, all carry themes of destruction and survival of humanity, tested by natural forces beyond its control. While these stories were shaped by many influences, it is hard not to see in them reflections of ancient experiences like those of the Younger Deuce. The universality of flood myths, in particular, suggests that many different peoples in many different places endured real floods that left such deep impressions they became timeless stories. The Younger Deuce also reminds us that myth and science are not opposed, but complementary. Science provides evidence, dates, and mechanisms. Myth provides the human experience, the memory of what it felt like to live through these events. Together, they offer a fuller picture of the past. Science can tell us that Lake Agassiz drained catastrophically, raising sea levels and flooding valleys. Myth can tell us what it meant to watch the waters rise, to lose a homeland, to start again. It is important, too, to remember that for the people of the Younger Dryas, these were not distant events. They lived realities shaping lives directly. Myth was not just about remembering the past, but about living with the present. In a world where climate shifted suddenly, where cold could return in a single lifetime, stories reinforced the idea that the earth was unpredictable, that survival required vigilance and adaptation. Legends and ice preserved in memory, and myth are one of the ways the Younger Driver still speaks to us. We may not have their exact words, but we have their echoes in stories of floods and fires, of endless winters and vanished beasts. These echoes remind us that the people of 12,000 years ago were not so different from us. They too faced uncertainty. They too searched for meaning, and they too told stories to make sense of their world. And so as the Younger Dryists tested humanity with cold, drought, flood, and fire, it also gave rise to legends. Legends that endured long after the ice retreated, carried forward by voices around campfires, by parents teaching children, by elders reminding communities of what had come before. Legends that still whisper to us today, when we hear stories of worlds destroyed and remade. For more than 1,000 years, the earth was locked in the grip of the Younger Dryas. Winters were longer and harsher than before. Summers were shorter and less predictable. Rainfall patterns had shifted, and people across continents had adapted to a world of scarcity. Generations had grown up never knowing anything else. For them, the cold was not an interruption. but reality itself, the way the world simply was. And then, as suddenly as the cold had returned, it ended. Ice cores drilled from Greenland hold the clearest record of this transition. Layer by layer, year by year, they preserve the chemical signatures of ancient temperatures. When scientists studied these cores, they were stunned by what they found. Around 11,700 years ago, temperatures in Greenland jumped by as much as 10 C in just a few decades, perhaps even less. In climate terms, this was nearly instantaneous. One moment, the Earth was cold, the next it was warm, and the Holocene epoch, the stable, mild climate that we still live in today, had begun. What caused this sudden end remains as much a mystery as the beginning of the Younger Dryas. The leading explanation is that the same Atlantic circulation system that had faltered at the start now restarted. Once the balance of salinity and temperature returned, the conveyor belt roared back to life, carrying warm water northward again. Heat flooded back into the northern hemisphere. Forests advanced. Glaciers retreated for the last time, and the Earth entered a new chapter. But why the system restarted when it did so abruptly is still debated. Some suggest that the melting of ice sheets had slowed by then, reducing the input of fresh water that had disrupted the conveyor. With less fresh water diluting the Atlantic, the salty surface could sink again, reviving the circulation. Others propose that the climate system reached a tipping point, a threshold beyond which stability could no longer be maintained, and so it flipped rapidly to a new state. In this view, the Younger Dryas was not so much ended by a single cause as by the inherent instability of the system itself. Whatever the mechanism, the effect was dramatic. Forests spread across Europe in just a few centuries. Grasses gave way to trees and tundra retreated northward. Animals responded in kind with herds of reindeer moving farther north, and species like red deer and wild boar expanding into new habitats. Rivers flowed more steadily again as rains returned, lakes refilled, and ecosystems regained productivity. Where once there had been scarcity, there was abundance once more. For humans, the sudden warming was transformative. Communities that had been mobile, constantly searching for food, now found stability returning. Plants grew more reliably, animals became more predictable, and resources concentrated in particular regions. For the Newfians and their descendants in the Fertile Crescent, this meant that the experiments with cultivation begun under stress could now flourish. Grains that had been unreliable during the Younger Dryas ripened consistently in the warmer Holocene. Villages expanded and true farming societies emerged. Within a few thousand years, cities would rise on these foundations. In Europe, hunter-gatherers expanded into the forests, developing new ways of life in landscapes transformed by trees. Fishing and gathering became increasingly important as rivers and lakes filled with life. In North America, cultures adapted to changing animal populations as mammoths and mastodons disappeared forever, while deer, elk, and bison became staples of survival. Everywhere, the end of the Younger Dryas was a rebirth, a chance to remake lives around abundance rather than scarcity. But the suddenness of the change must have been disorienting. Imagine growing up in a world where summers were brief, winters unrelenting, and food uncertain, only to see in your lifetime a new climate emerge. Forests appeared where none had been before, rivers flowing stronger, animals returning. It would have felt like the earth itself was alive, changing moods overnight. For those who had heard stories of endless cold, it must have seemed miraculous. A world restored after centuries of hardship. The timing of this warming is significant. The Holocene, which began with the end of the Younger Dryas, provided the stability that allowed agriculture, civilization, and eventually history as we know it to develop. Without this stability, human societies might have remained mobile for much longer, unable to build the surpluses necessary for cities and states. The sudden end of the Younger Dryas then was not just a climate event. It was the threshold between prehistory and history, between survival and civilization. Geological records show how abrupt the transformation was. Pollen cores from lakes across Europe and the Middle East record the rapid spread of trees such as oak, elm, and hazel, replacing grasses and shrubs in a matter of centuries. In some regions, the change appears almost instantaneous, as though the landscape had been repainted. Sediments show shifts in erosion and deposition as rainfall patterns stabilize. Ice calls from Antarctica also show changes, though more gradual, indicating that the effects were global, but felt most sharply in the northern hemisphere. This sudden return to warmth has also raised questions about resilience. If the Earth's climate could flip so abruptly once, could it do so again? Modern concerns about the weakening of the Atlantic circulation echo the younger Dryas, with scientists warning that disruptions in ocean currents could cause sudden shifts. While the exact circumstances are different today, the lesson remains that the climate system is capable of rapid change, and humans must be prepared for surprises. For the people who lived through it, however, the focus would not have been on mechanisms or predictions, but on the lived experience of abundance returning, springs flowing again, animals multiplying, plants flourishing. For them, it was not a scientific puzzle, but a gift, an opening of possibilities. They may have explained it through myth, through stories of gods relenting or worlds reborn. Whatever the explanations, the practical reality was that life became easier, survival less precarious. The end of the younger Deuce also left a permanent mark on memory. Just as myths of floods and fire may recall its onset, myths of rebirth and renewal may echo its end. Stories of golden ages, of worlds restored after catastrophe, may be distant memories of this sudden warming. It was not only a change in climate, but a change in the human imagination. After 1,000 years of hardship, people could imagine abundance again, could build futures not only around survival, but around growth. And so the younger Dryas ended not with a slow fade, but with a sharp break. One world vanished, another began. The cold retreated, the warmth surged, and humanity stepped into a new era. For scientists today, this transition remains a fascinating mystery, a case study in abrupt climate change. For the people of 12,000 years ago, it was the turning of the Earth's page, the moment when the hardships of generations gave way to the opportunities of a new world. When the younger Deuce came to its abrupt end, the change was not simply a shift in temperature charts or rainfall maps. It was a reawakening of the Earth itself, a transformation visible in every landscape, audible in every forest, and felt in every community of people who lived through it. For over 1,000 years, the world had been cold and hesitant, its ecosystems constrained, its abundance limited. Then, almost overnight, in geological terms, life surged forward again. The hauling had begun, and the world that we recognize today started to take shape. The evidence for this reawakening is written in pollen grains preserved in lake sediments. Scientists studying cores taken from across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia see the same story repeated. Grasses and shrubs replaced by trees, barren tundra giving way to dense forests. In some places, oak and hazel spread so rapidly that within a few generations, landscapes that had been open and treeless became shaded woodlands. For animals, this meant new habitats, new feeding grounds, and new migration routes. Reindeer retreated to the far north, while deer, wild boar, and other forest dwellers flourished in the newly formed woodlands. Rivers and lakes also responded. With rainfall stabilizing and glaciers retreating, water systems regained their vigor. Seasonal floods once again nourished floodplains, creating fertile soils that encouraged plants to grow in abundance. Fish populations rebounded in rivers, providing a reliable source of protein for human communities. Wetlands expanded, supporting birds and small game. The natural world was not just recovering, it was booming, reshaping itself with a vitality unseen for thousands of years. For humans, the reawakening meant opportunity. Communities that had scraped by during the cold now found themselves surrounded by abundance. In Europe, hunter-gatherers adapted quickly to the spread of forests. They developed new technologies to hunt forest animals, trap birds, and catch fish. They collected nuts, berries, and fruits that grew in the woodlands, supplementing their diets with a variety that had been impossible in the tundra. Archaeological sites from this period show an increase in diversity of food remains, suggesting that people were broadening their diets to match the new ecosystems around them. In the Fertile Crescent, the reawakening accelerated the shift to farming. The wild cereals that the Nufians had begun to experiment with during the Younger Goose now grew more consistently in the warmer climate. Villages expanded, storage facilities became larger, and the first truly domesticated crops appeared. With them came the domestication of animals, such as goats and sheep, creating a more reliable and controllable food supply. The abundance of the hauling allowed communities to invest in permanent settlements, and in time, these settlements would grow into the first cities. The agricultural revolution nurtured in hardship during the Younger Deuce blossomed in the warmth that followed. The reawakening also brought population growth. With more food available, human groups expanded in number and size. Settlements became larger, more permanent, and more complex. Archaeological evidence shows increasing signs of social differentiation, with some individuals buried with more goods than others, suggesting the beginnings of social hierarchies. Trade networks expanded too, carrying obsidian shells and other goods over long distances. As the natural world reawakened, so too did human society, entering a new phase of complexity and ambition. But the reawakening was not uniform everywhere. In some regions, the warming created deserts rather than abundance. Parts of North Africa that had been semi-arid during the Younger Deuce briefly bloomed into grasslands and lakes, attracting human groups. But as the Holocene progressed, these areas dried once again, forcing new migrations and adaptations. In other places, rising seas swallowed coastlines. Communities that had lived along Ice Age shores saw their homes vanish beneath the waves as glaciers melted and oceans rose by tens of meters. For them, the reawakening of the earth carried both gifts and losses. What is remarkable is how quickly humans responded. Rising seas did not wipe out communities. They moved. Expanding forests did not trap people. They adapted their hunting strategies. Droughts in some regions did not cause collapse. They encouraged innovation, such as irrigation in the centuries that followed. The Younger Deuce had trained humanity in resilience, and the Holocene allowed that resilience to flower into creativity. Culturally, the reawakening may have inspired new myths and symbols. After generations of cold, the return of warmth must have felt miraculous. It is not hard to imagine stories of gods or spirits who had relented, of worlds reborn, of golden ages following hardship, just as myths of floods and fire may echo the onset of the Younger. Dryas myths of rebirth and renewal may reflect its end. The idea of paradise regained of gardens of abundance may have roots in the real experience of watching the world reawaken. The reawakening was not only ecological and cultural, but geological. As ice sheets melted, the weight pressing down on continents lifted. Land that had been depressed by kiln of ice began to rebound, slowly rising over centuries. Shorelines shifted, not just from rising seas, but from the land itself moving. Earthquakes and volcanic eruptions became more common in some regions. As the crust adjusted, the earth was alive in every sense, reshaping itself in response to the end of the Ice Age. For the people living through it, the changes must have been astonishing. A child born in the last centuries of the Younger Dryas could by the end of their life see landscapes utterly transformed. Valleys filled with trees that had not been there in their youth. Rivers flowing where once there had been only dry beds. Animals appearing in numbers unimaginable a generation before. The pace of change was so rapid that it would have been obvious, visible, undeniable. The world was not only alive, It was reawakening before their eyes. The Holling reawakening also set the stage for migration on a global scale. As conditions improved, human groups expanded into new lands. Northern Europe, once inhospitable, became home to growing populations. Siberia, freed from some of its ice age extremes, saw renewed human activity. Across the Americas, cultures adapted to new ecosystems as forests and grasslands expanded. Australia's landscape shifted as well, with Aboriginal peoples continuing to adapt their traditions to changing conditions. The reawakening of the Earth was a global phenomenon touching every continent and shaping every society. Looking back, it is tempting to see the end of the Young Dryas and the beginning of the Holling as the true dawn of humanity as we know it. It was in this period that agriculture took hold, that villages grew into towns, that trade expanded across continents, and that cultural complexity deepened. The reawakening was not just nature's recovery, but humanity's transformation. The stable climate of the Holling provided the foundation upon which all later civilizations were built. Without it, history as we know it might never have unfolded. The sudden end of the Younger Dryas was a shock, but it was also an opening. The Earth had turned the page, and with it, humanity stepped into a new era. The reawakening that followed was not simply about survival. It was about flourishing, about using abundance to build new ways of living, about turning resilience into innovation. The world had changed and humanity changed with it. As the Younger Dryas gave way to warmth and the Holling began, something remarkable took root. For countless generations, humans had lived as hunter-gatherers, adapting to shifting landscapes, chasing herds, and collecting the foods that the environment offered. The brief window of stability before the Younger Dryas had allowed the Newfians to begin experimenting with settled life. But the sudden return of cold had disrupted those efforts, forcing many to scatter again. When warmth returned, however, the conditions were different. This time the abundance lasted, the climate stabilized, and the experiments that had begun in desperation became the foundation of something new. It was here in this transition that the seeds of civilization were sown. The key was reliability. During the Younger Dryas, wild cereals had withered, animals had vanished from traditional hunting grounds, and rivers had dried or frozen unpredictably. But in the early Holling, the patterns returned to something much steadier. Rains fell more regularly, plants ripened on time, and animals followed predictable cycles. For humans, this meant they could finally trust the land to provide. That trust changed everything. When people could depend on the natural world, they could plan ahead. They could plant seeds with the expectation that harvest would come. They could store food knowing that seasons would bring more. They could invest in permanent homes, knowing they would not have to abandon them every few years. In the Fertile Crescent, the transformation was dramatic. The wild ancestors of wheat and barley grew thickly in the valleys and hills, and human hands had already learned to harvest them. Now, with stability, those hands began to shape the plants themselves. People selected seeds from the largest, most resilient stalks. Over generations, the plants changed. Their seeds grew bigger, their stalks less likely to shatter, making them easier to gather and more dependent on human cultivation. This was domestication, and it marked one of the most profound changes in human history. What had begun as gathering turned into farming. Alongside plants came animals. Goats and sheep once hunted were brought into closer contact with humans. Some were penned, bred, and eventually tamed. Over time, they became domesticated, providing not only meat, but also milk, hides, and wool. Dogs, already companions for hunting, grew even closer to human life, serving as protectors and helpers in this new way of living. Later, cattle and pigs joined the growing list of domesticated species. With plants and animals under their care, humans were no longer entirely at the mercy of wild ecosystems. They had begun to create their own. Permanent settlements followed. Villages grew larger, their houses more substantial. In places like Jericho, one of the world's oldest continuously occupied sites. Archaeologists have uncovered stone towers and walls dating back to this time. These were not temporary shelters, but structures that required collective effort, suggesting a new level of organization and cooperation. Storage facilities for grain became common, evidence of surpluses that could support communities through lean times. With surpluses came security. With security came growth. The seeds of civilization were not only biological but social. Farming required cooperation, families working together to sow and harvest, communities organizing irrigation and protection of fields, groups sharing tools and labor. This cooperation deepened social bonds and laid the groundwork for more complex societies. At the same time, surpluses allowed some individuals to specialize. Not everyone needed to hunt or farm. Some could craft tools, weave textiles, or focus on ritual and leadership. The beginnings of social differentiation appear in burials where some individuals were interred with more goods than others. Hierarchies, however modest, were emerging. Trade expanded as well. Farming communities produced surpluses that could be exchanged for materials not available locally. Obsidian for blades, shells for ornaments, pigments for decoration, all moved along trade routes that grew in length and complexity. These exchanges were not only economic but cultural, spreading ideas, technologies, and symbols across wide regions. The seeds of interconnected civilizations were being planted alongside the seeds of crops. The transformation was not uniform everywhere, nor was it without challenges. Farming was labor-intensive, often harder on the body than hunting and gathering. Early agriculturalists worked long hours in fields. Their diets narrowed to fewer staples, and their skeletons show signs of wear from repetitive tasks. Disease also became more common in denser settlements, where waste accumulated and close contact spread pathogens. Yet despite these drawbacks, the stability and surplus offered by farming outweighed the hardships. Populations grew, communities flourished, and the momentum towards civilization continued. In other parts of the world, similar processes unfolded. In China, millet and rice were domesticated in the river valleys. In Mesoamerica, maize, beans, and squash became staples. In the Andes, potatoes and quinoa were cultivated alongside the domestication of llamas and alpacas. In Africa, sorghum and yams were brought under human care. Each region found its own path to agriculture, shaped by its environment, but all were part of the same broader shift. Humans are learning to cultivate rather than simply collect. The younger Deuce had delayed this revolution, but its end unlocked it across the globe. Culturally, the seeds of civilization were also seeds of imagination. Farming anchored people to specific places, and with that came deeper connections to land. Sacred sites emerged, often marked by monuments or gathering places. One of the most striking is Gobek in modern Turkey, dating to around the same time. Massive stone pillars carved with animals and symbols were arranged in circles, suggesting communal gatherings of hundreds of people built by hunter-gatherers on the cusp of farming. It shows that ritual and community organization were already taking monumental form. Farming did not just produce food. It produced culture, religion, and identity tied to place. The memory of the younger Dryas likely lingered as well. Generations that had lived through scarcity would have remembered the uncertainty of the past. Farming may have seemed not only an opportunity, but a necessity, a way to protect against the return of instability. Myths and traditions could have reinforced the importance of tending fields, honoring animals, and maintaining balance with the natural world. In this sense, the hardship of the younger Deuce shaped the mindset of the early Holocene, embedding caution and foresight into the foundations of civilization. As centuries passed, the seeds sown in this period grew. Villages turned into towns, towns grew into cities. Writing, trade networks, states, and empires would eventually emerge from these first experiments in cultivation. But at the root of it all was this moment, the end of the younger Dryas, the reawakening of the earth, and the first deliberate planting of seeds. It was not a single step, but a gradual unfolding shaped by necessity and creativity, by resilience and opportunity. And yet it was decisive. Humanity had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The seeds of civilization were both literal and metaphorical. They were the grains scattered in tilled soil. The goats and sheep quarreled near villages, the ideas of cooperation and surplus, the rituals that bound communities together. Each one sprouted in the fertile ground of the Helene, watered by the abundance of a warming world. Each one carried within it the potential for growth, far beyond what its planters could have imagined. And so, as the world reawakened from its frozen pause, humans did not simply return to old ways. They invented new ones. They planted the seeds of crops, of animals, of communities, of culture that would grow into civilizations. The younger Dryas had tested them with fire, ice, flood, and famine. The Helene offered a different challenge: how to use abundance wisely, how to build not only for survival, but for permanence. In rising to that challenge, humanity transformed the world forever. The younger Deuce is long past. Yet, it remains one of the most important episodes in the story of our planet. Not because it was the coldest period humans ever endured, nor because it lasted the longest, but because of how suddenly it arrived, how dramatically it reshaped ecosystems and societies, and how quickly it ended. It is the clearest reminder in the geological and archaeological record that climate does not always move slowly. Sometimes it lurches. Sometimes it changes so quickly that entire ways of life are overturned in a single human lifetime. And from that truth, lessons emerge. Lessons that reach across millennia, from the people who endured the younger Deuce to us, who face a very different climate crisis today. One of the first lessons is that human beings are resilient. The onset of the younger Deuce would have felt catastrophic. Families who had built villages, who had begun to rely on wild cereals ripening each season, suddenly found themselves in a world where rains no longer came, where summers were cut short, where familiar animals migrated elsewhere or disappeared altogether. Yet they did not vanish. They adapted. Some moved and took up more mobile ways of life again. Others experimented with new strategies, tending plants, coring animals, and storing food. Even in times of great hardship, they found ways to persist. That resilience was not guaranteed. It was built day by day in choices about what to eat, where to travel, how to cooperate. And it is the same resilience we rely on today in the face of our own environmental challenges. A second lesson is that crises often spark innovation. Farming did not begin in a paradise of plenty, but in the hardship of the younger Deuce. It was not abundance that drove people to plant seeds, but scarcity. The same pressure that forced communities to abandon their homes also pushed them toward the first experiments with cultivation. From those experiments came agriculture, and from agriculture came everything we associate with civilization. The pathway was not linear or inevitable. It was forged in response to the crisis. That pattern repeats through history. When faced with disruption, humans innovate, and those innovations often transform the world. The younger Deuce also shows us that climate change can be global yet uneven. While Europe and North America froze, some regions experienced different effects. Rainfall patterns shifted in South America, with some areas receiving more precipitation even as others dried out. In Asia, monsoon systems weakened, disrupting rivers and agriculture. In Africa, the Sahara expanded and contracted in cycles, forcing migrations along the Nile. This unevenness meant that while some communities suffered, others found new opportunities. The lesson is that climate change does not strike all places the same way, and responses must be local as well as global for modern societies. That truth is crucial. Some regions will face droughts, others floods, others rising seas. There will be no single solution, Adaptation must be as diverse as the challenges. Another lesson lies in the sensitivity of Earth's climate system. The younger Dryas may have been triggered by something as simple as fresh water flowing into the North Atlantic. That single disruption was enough to stall the great conveyor belt of ocean currents and plunge the Northern Hemisphere back into Ice Age conditions. The event reminds us that the climate is not a static background, but a living system with tipping points and thresholds. Push it too far in one direction, and it can flip to another state entirely. For scientists today, this is a warning. The modern climate warmed by greenhouse gases may also have tipping points, moments where gradual change gives way to abrupt shifts. The melting of Greenland's ice, the thawing of permafrost, the dieback of rainforests, each could set off chain reactions with global consequences. The younger Dryas also teaches the importance of memory. The people who lived through it did not leave written records, but they left stories, myths of floods, of fire, of endless winter. These were not just tales for entertainment. They were cultural memories of real events, warnings encoded in narrative form. By passing them down, communities preserved lessons about survival, about resilience, about the unpredictability of the Earth. Today, we have more precise tools, ice cores, satellite data, and climate models. But the principle is the same. We must remember, record, and learn. Forgetting the past is one of the surest ways to repeat its mistakes. Perhaps the most sobering lesson is that abrupt change can arrive without warning. For centuries, the Earth warmed after the last ice age. Forests spread, animals multiplied, humans thrived. Then, almost instantly, the warmth vanished and the cold returned. For over 1,000 years, the world was locked in that freeze until it ended just as suddenly. To people at the time, these changes must have seemed inexplicable, beyond comprehension. To us, they are a reminder that the climate system is not bound to human timescales. It can shift far faster than civilizations can adjust. The danger today is not that change is impossible to foresee, but that it may arrive more quickly than our societies are prepared to handle. Yet, there is also a hopeful lesson. Just as abruptly as the younger Deuce began, it ended. The Earth warmed, forest returned, animals thrived, and humans seized the opportunity to build the foundations of civilization. Out of hardship came renewal. Out of scarcity came innovation. The past does not promise that the future will unfold the same way, but it does show that adaptation and resilience can carry humanity through even the harshest disruptions. The final lesson may be humility. The younger Dryas was not caused by humans. It was a natural event triggered by forces far beyond the control of small human groups scattered across the planet. Yet its effects were total. It shaped lives, cultures, and the trajectory of our species. Today, by contrast, the climate change we face is driven by human activity. That difference brings responsibility. We cannot prevent volcanic eruptions or cosmic impacts, but we can decide how much carbon we emit, how we manage forests and oceans, how we respond to warning signs. The younger Deuce shows us what happens when the climate shifts suddenly. The question for us is whether we'll act before our own disruptions push the system past another threshold. For those who lived through it, the lessons were immediate. Stay mobile. Diversify food sources. Cooperate with neighbors. Tell stories that preserve memory. For us, the lessons are broader, but no less urgent. Respect the fragility of the climate system. Prepare for uneven impacts. Invest in resilience and innovation. And above all, remember that change can be abrupt. The younger Deuce is not just a chapter in prehistory. It is a message carved into ice and stone. A warning from 12,000 years ago that still speaks to us now. And as we look back, we see not only a world frozen, but a humanity that endured. That endurance is our inheritance, a reminder that while the Earth may shift suddenly, we are capable of adapting. The challenge is to do so wisely, learning from the past anticipating the future, and carrying forward the lessons of an abrupt climate shift that once changed the world. A younger Deuce is a story of disruption, resilience, and transformation. But it is also a story about rhythm. The Earth has never been still. Its climate, its oceans, its winds, its very surface have always been in motion, shifting on scales both vast and intimate. Ice ages come and go. Warm periods rise and fall. Oceans advance and retreat. Life expands, collapses, and adapts. The younger Dryas was not an exception, but part of this rhythm, a sudden, dramatic beat in the long song of the planet. And as we look at our fragile future, we must recognize that we are still living within those rhythms, even as we alter them with our own actions. One of the clearest lessons of the younger Dryas is that the Earth as climate system is capable of abrupt shifts. For more than 1,000 years, the world was locked into cold, and then within the span of a single lifetime, it shifted into warmth. That suddenness is both humbling and alarming. It reminds us that stability is not guaranteed, that even small disruptions can trigger massive responses, and that the comfort we feel in a stable climate is a temporary gift. Our modern world with its cities, its global trade, and its billions of people is built on that gift. The relatively stable Holocene that began when the younger Deuce ended. But just as suddenly as stability arrived 12,000 years ago, it could be shaken again. Today, the forces of disruption are not only natural, but human. Greenhouse gases released by burning fossil fuels are altering the atmosphere at a pace unmatched in human history. Ice sheets are melting, seas are rising, and extreme weather is becoming more common. Scientists warn that we may be approaching tipping points, thresholds where gradual warming could lead to abrupt and irreversible changes. The melting of Greenland's ice, the weakening of the Atlantic circulation, the release of methane from thawing permafrost. Each of these echoes the kinds of mechanisms that drove the younger Dryas. The difference now is that we are the ones applying the pressure. This makes our position unique. The people of the younger Dryas had no control over the forces reshaping their world. They could only adapt. We, however, have both knowledge and agency. We can measure greenhouse gases, model future climates, and understand the consequences of our actions. That gives us responsibility. The fragility of our future lies not only in the power of natural rhythms, but in the choices we make about whether to accelerate them or to slow them, whether to prepare or to ignore. Yet fragility does not mean helplessness. If the younger Dryas showed anything, it is that humans are capable of remarkable adaptation. People endured cold, drought, fire, and scarcity. They moved, innovated, and survived. They learned to plant seeds and domesticate animals, to trade and cooperate, to tell stories that carried knowledge forward. Out of hardship came farming, and out of farming came civilization. That resilience is still part of us. The question is whether we can channel it before crises become catastrophes. Whether we can adapt not reactively after disaster strikes, but proactively, preparing for what we know is coming. There is also a deeper lesson in humility. The Earth's rhythms are vast, stretching across millennia. Our lives are short in comparison. The younger Deuce teaches us that entire civilizations can rise and fall within a single climatic shift. That what feels eternal to us is temporary to the planet. Rivers move, forests shift, coasts vanish, animals disappear. These rhythms are natural, and we are part of them. The fragility of our future lies in forgetting that fact, in imagining that we are separate from the systems that sustain us. The younger Deuce also invites us to think about scale. For people then, the destruction was local and immediate. Fields withering, animals gone, water drying. For us, the disruption is global. Carbon released in one part of the world warms the entire planet. Melting ice in Greenland raises seas everywhere. The interconnectedness of modern society means that no place is isolated. A drought in one region can affect food prices globally. A flood in another can disrupt supply chains continents away. Just as the younger Dryas showed that climate disruptions ripple across the globe, today's world shows how those ripples can move through human systems as well as natural ones. And yet within this fragility, there is also continuity. The rhythms of Earth have always included disruption, ice advances, ice retreats. Seas rise, seas fall, forests expand, forests contract. The younger Deuce was one moment in that ongoing dance, a reminder that change is not the enemy, but the nature of the system itself. The danger lies not in change alone, but in the speed of change, in how abruptly the rhythms shift. For humans, the challenge is not to stop change. That is impossible, but to live wisely within it. To adapt at the pace required to anticipate rather than simply endure. There is also something to be said about memory. The younger Deuce left its traces in myths of floods and fires, in bones of vanished animals, in the ruins of abandoned villages. Those were the ways ancient peoples preserved the memory of abrupt change. Today, we preserve it with ice cores, with climate models, with satellite records. Both are forms of storytelling, one oral and symbolic, the other scientific and numerical. Both are attempts to carry forward the lessons of the past into the decisions of the future. If we ignore those lessons, the fragility of our future will become vulnerable. If we heed them, fragility can become foresight. Looking at the younger Deuce from the distance of 12,000 years, we see both warning and inspiration. The warning is that climate can shift suddenly without notice, overturning ways of life that seem permanent. The inspiration is that humanity endured, adapted, and even used the crisis as a springboard for innovation. Our fragile future is shaped by both of these truths. We cannot assume stability, but neither should we assume collapse. What matters is how we respond. The rhythms of Earth will continue. Ice sheets will wax and wane. Seas will rise and fall. Forests will spread and retreat. Over tens of thousands of years, the planet will pass through new ages, new climates, new balances. Our task is not to halt these rhythms, but to live wisely within them, to ensure that our societies can withstand their shifts. The fragility of our future lies not in the rhythms themselves, but in how unprepared we may be to live in harmony with them. And so, as we look ahead, the younger Dryas stands as both mirror and message. It shows us what abrupt change looks like. It shows us how people adapt when survival is on the line. It shows us that innovation often comes from hardship. And it shows us that the rhythms of Earth are powerful, unstoppable, and indifferent to human wishes. Our fragile future lies in recognizing that truth and acting accordingly, not with despair, but with resilience, humility, and foresight. The story of the young Dryas is not just ancient history. It is a reminder written in ice, soil, myth, and memory. A reminder that the Earth does not move at our pace, but at its own. That change can be sudden, and that survival depends on adaptation. 12,000 years ago, people faced a world transformed overnight. They endured, and in enduring, they set the stage for civilization itself. Today, we face our own transformations, driven this time by ourselves. The rhythms of the Earth continue, and our task is clear to remember, to prepare, and to act wisely within the fragile balance of our future.